Oh, I'm
not.
I'm gonna get in that habit too, aren't I?
It's contagious.
It is contagious, yeah. I better move away from you a little bit, Charlie. We have a full agenda again today, and so we're going to try to move through it as quickly as we can. We're going to get started right now with our very first item this morning is charter schools. And Tanya, it's up to you.
Mr. Chairman, if we could call the roll to begin the meeting.
Maybe we should do that.
All right, sir. For the Joint Education Interim Committee, September 9th. Representative Sommers.
Here.
Representative Obermueller.
Here.
Representative Newsom.
Here.
Representative Nyman.
Here.
Representative Harshman. Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Brown.
Excuse.
Excused. Thank you. Representative Andrew. Thank you. Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Senator Salazar.
Here.
Senator Beitman.
Here.
Senator Ellis. Co-Chairman Scott.
Here.
Co-Chairman Paxton.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay, with that, Tanya, it's all yours.
Mr. Chairman, recall in the last session, you passed Bill Senate File 130. It became Chapter 169. The proponent of the bill was Senator Driscoll. I think he's in the audience here today. It was a fairly comprehensive bill revising the authorizing statutes for charter schools in Wyoming by authorizing the SLIB to approve charter schools request to operate. Prior to the enactment of this particular piece of legislation, school districts were required were the sole authority to authorize the operation of charter schools. There was an ability to appeal to the State Board of Education in the event that a charter school was denied, and that process was actually utilized a couple of times early on in charter schools operations. It includes additional defined terms relative to an authorizer, which is you'll see a change throughout the bill. Eliminated some of the oversight of school districts over the operations of charter schools. It also allows for charter schools to specifically target at-risk and special education students for enrollment as well as with their programs. It authorizes charter schools sponsored jointly or separately by the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho Indian tribes, and also allows them to give preference to members or eligible members for their enrollment. It also modified the district's ability to have board members or district employees on the governing body. In addition, existing statutes authorize school districts the ability to waive statutory or local requirements, and that ability has also been eliminated. It clarified that charter schools are subject to a variety of provisions, including civil rights, health or safety requirements, assessment and accountability in the Public Meetings and Public Records Act, and any school district federal privacy laws. It specifies that a contractual requirement between a charter school and the authorizer is required to be before the body for renewal. The renewal can be 5 years, or in the event that the charter authorizer feels that a different time period is appropriate, that's also authorized. After 1 year of operation, the SLIB, who is the State Lands Investment Board, comprised of the 5 elected officials, may designate operation to the local district for any of the authorizing functions over a charter school that has been authorized by the SLIB. It establishes requirements associated with a virtual charter school as authorized in the bill, and there are specific requirements associated with that type of school as well. It modified the provisions governing the contractual obligations between the authorizer and the charter school, as well as the application process. In the event that an application is submitted to the SLIB, it is referred to the Department of Education to determine whether the components and it complies with the application requirements and sufficient information is provided for consideration. It continues to require a public hearing to determine the support by the local local people and professional educators for the charter school. And it also modified the provisions to require an in-person interview as well with the authorizer. As I stated, the length of the charter school remains 5 years, but allows that term to vary. There are annual reporting requirements that remain to the State Board of Education. The funding is a large modification in the bill. In the event the charter school and the authorizer can't come to an agreement with regard to, or excuse me, the district, not the authorizer, the district cannot come to an agreement with regard to the funding pursuant to statute. In the event it's an in-person virtual education program, the charter school is entitled to 80% of the amount allocated under the education resource block grant model to the school. And in the event it's a virtual charter school, they're entitled to 65% of that amount. Section 5 of the bill limits the charter schools to 3, and not more than 3 are authorized under the provisions applicable to the SLIDS authorization of charter schools. And it also requires the state superintendent to review the impacts and benefits of charter schools and report back to this body. Section 6 requires a study by the JEC as well as a review of the legislation. I would note that the statutory provisions and the revisions to those are effective July 1st of 2022. I did speak to the Department of Education approximately 3 weeks ago about this program. They indicated that they are in the preliminary stages of drafting rules and regulations to govern this program. I think they may actually have some public comment as well. With that, subject to your questions.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Representative Sommers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I remember that charter school can be authorized for 5 years and then it can be renewed for 5 years. But I don't remember if is it clear in statute, what if a charter school sells to a different corporation? So for example, a charter school is owned by one corporation, sells to another. Would it then be subject to some kind of renewal? Would it, and you can get me that later. I'm just kind of curious about that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers, I'll have to look into that. I know there are specific provisions associated with the application process in the event that you're going to use an education service provider, but I didn't review what happens if those change hands during the operation of the charter school.
Co-Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, in partial answer to that, I think it's contemplated that most of the charter schools, maybe all of them, will be local nonprofit organizations. And what some of them will probably try to do is contract with a national provider to actually operate it. But I think if you shift those providers, you have to get approval from your authorizer to do it.
That's
And
what I'm curious.
yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's true. But the local outfit would remain, and they're nonprofit, and I don't see the kind of selling that you would see in the for-profit sector there.
Okay, any other questions from the committee?
Yes.
Comments? Yes, okay, go ahead.
As I read section 5, which is a non-codified provision, that's that limit of 3, that just applies to the number that can apply to the State Loan and Investment Board to be authorized. There isn't a limit on what the local districts could do. Is that a correct reading?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any other questions, comments, from the committee? All right. Looks like next on our agenda is a review of Governor Gordon's letter, and Lachelle Brandt, I believe, is here to present that. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Lachelle Brandt, Senior Policy Advisor for Governor Gordon. Thank you for this opportunity to come before you this morning to revisit Governor Gordon's letter and concerns he outlined with Senate File 130 and Rolled Act 74. He appreciates your commitment from the committee to continue to examine the statute and how it fits within our current existing education system and how we continue to improve education in Wyoming. You have the letter before you, so rather than read it, I will be brief in highlighting three main points. On page 1 of the letter, the governor notes that the bill appears to correct impressions rather than circumstances. While he agrees with removing any structural impediments within the law that would discourage charter schools, the fact is new charter schools have been established under the existing law and applications have not been denied without extensive review by local school boards and the State Board of Education. Therefore, it was and still is unclear what the bill was actually trying to correct, what barriers exist, and overall, if the changes made to the existing law would ultimately lead to positive benefits for students and to the current system. A continued evaluation of what the actual circumstances for charter schools is warranted. I'll move to page 2 of the letter. The governor raised concerns regarding the removal of the State Board of Education from the process and assigning the State Loan and Investment Board as the second authorizer for charter schools. Wyoming prides itself on local control, and school boards are elected to make the educational decisions on behalf of the community. They are well positioned to be the first to determine if a charter is reflective of the needs within a district and a community. However, the new legislation allows for applicants to go directly to the state 5 elected officials and use a new appeals process. Under the law prior to Senate File 130, if an applicant was denied and questioned the determination by a school board, appealing to the State Board of Education for a second review to determine if the application fit within the requirements of the law appeared to have worked over the last 2 decades. As Ms. Heitrick pointed out, since the time of the letter, it was brought to our attention that historically there actually have been a few charter applications that did indeed go through the test and appeal process, and the applications were denied by the State Board of Education. The review process was extensive and presented findings of fact and conclusions of law that are required and essential to ensure that the establishment of a charter is within the best interests of pupils, school districts, or the community. In all cases, there were findings that would have posed significant issues if the applications would not have been denied by the local school boards. Some of those examples would be failure of the curriculum to meet district accreditation requirements, lack of community support, financial feasibility, failure to meet school facility requirements, or discriminatory practices based solely on academics. The governor does not view the SLIB as the best positioned entity to authorize charters or review appeals. He believes while local districts and state boards are the most common authorizers amongst other states nationally, perhaps other Wyoming boards, for example, higher education boards may be better suited to assume this responsibility rather than the SLIB, which consists of the 5 elected officials who are elected for different reasons and tasked with specific duties. On page 3, paragraph 3 of the letter raises important concerns that span beyond philosophical concerns and begin to question if legislation would stand up to constitutional scrutiny. There are 2 concerns regarding disparity in funding. The first concern is that the Wyoming Supreme Court has reminded the legislature in the Campbell cases that it must provide a complete and uniform system of public education that provides a quality of education to all students. Yet, as this letter points out, under the new legislation, it is possible that a charter may receive only 80% of funding for some students and falls to 65% for virtual charter schools. Secondly, if a district is the authorizer and approves the charter, that charter may receive 100% of the funding, which could cause a disparity among charter schools across the state. This is an area that the governor believes should be addressed before this legislation takes place. The governor recognizes the unique learning environments and opportunities that charter schools can present for teachers and for students. He understands the value they may have in serving as incubators for innovation in communities. And he appreciates the legislature carefully reviewing the changes to the existing law to ensure that under the new law, charter schools continue to grow in a direction that will benefit all students. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Sommers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I'm not a huge fan of this bill, never was. And not a fan of charter schools, frankly. But I thought long and hard, and in fact, originally I in an amendment, I carved out SLIB. But then when you think about it, SLIB is really not, I guess they are not, they do our investments as well, right? Yet they're not investors, and other than maybe private investors. So they are people that we elect statewide because we believe they can make good judgment and decisions on a variety of things. So I think it's not outside the realm of possibility that SLIB is qualified, right? And probably they would take the time to review all of the things that are important in this piece of legislation. So I think SLIB is, I'm wondering where the reluctance is on the SLIB piece. That's my question back to you. I don't understand why the governor feels they're not as qualified as any other 5 or 6 members of the public or that may be involved in education discussions.
Would you
Mr.
like to weigh in
Chairman,
on that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers, from his experience serving on local school boards as well as the SLIB, from his experiences, he just doesn't feel that they're the best to make that determination. And I think it would be unprecedented across all states to use this type of approach. But you're correct. I think certainly they have the capability of those responsibilities. But as I suggested, I think that he feels other boards may be better suited for that responsibility.
Co-Chair Scott.
Mr. Chairman, and I think Representative Sommers just articulated some of my feelings there. And on the SLIB, it does seem to me that because they are elected, that they are in a unique position to judge the merits of some of these things. And frankly, one of the reasons I'm a supporter of charter schools is I think a little competition would help with some of the problems, Mr. Chairman, at the local district level. And for that reason, they may have trouble getting approved by the local district, who may or may not care to have a competitor. I would say on the 80% figure, I was involved in getting that figure put together. And the advice we were getting from charter school operations elsewhere and from the national organizations involved in this was that given the way Wyoming is funding things, that they perfectly well could operate with 80%. I was a little taken aback. They thought they could operate with even less than that. But we'll see. I think it is a measure of what's going on, that the people from outside, some of the national organizations involved with experience in other states, were saying, yeah, 80% would work for us, Mr. Chairman. But that's where it came from.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead, Senator Ross.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a question for you. What is our intent? Do we want to redebate this bill? Because I'm happy to lay into it again. But really, what are we intending to do here?
Yeah, I think follow the statute. Yeah.
Follow the statute? What does that actually mean for us? What is the purpose of the JEC looking at this right now, if it passed, again, if we want to go through why I voted against it, I'll go through all my arguments once again. If we want to hear about the virtues of it, we can do that. But a serious question, do we want to work on it and refine it and bring a bill draft that somehow tries to make it better? I really don't understand what the objective is.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Part of the objective was just now to explore a little bit what the governor's objections were and see, was there something there that required immediate legislation? The other reason it's on our interim agenda, and then we need to bring it up, is that as with any complicated legislation, we are perfectly capable, as we start to try to figure out how we're going to implement it, of finding some glitch that was in there, that's something that just technical thing that doesn't work, requires a bill to cure the problem. I have been, and I will disclose the committee, Mr. Chairman, I'm currently on a steering committee for a group that is exploring one here in Casper, and I said yes to that because one of the things I wanted to do was to see whether the way a complicated statute like this is put together, were there problems we're going to simply make something that made a lot of sense infeasible in Wyoming because of some technical requirement in the legislation. And I'm happy to report to the committee, although we've identified some potential problems, we haven't identified anything that would, at this point, it looks like it makes it just a non-starter. But it's always possible we'll come up with such a thing. And so that was one of the reasons we put this on the interim committee, because, you know, my experience with complicated legislation is sooner or later you find something like that. And this is undeniably complicated legislation, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up?
Well, Mr. Chairman, then I'll keep it short if we're not going to delve into the details very much, but it is complicated, but in reality, I'll just reiterate some of the concerns I had last session and express to the sponsors and others. This seems like a way to circumvent an effective system that previously eliminated the possibility of what are effectively for-profit schools in the state of Wyoming because they did not meet the educational rigor requirements of the objectives of the State Board of Education or of the local boards of education that have an obligation to look at what's best and in the best interest of the students in those areas. Instead, it shifts it to a political theater where we have 5 statewide electives that certainly can do the due diligence, but they have different pressures. And I think the expectation and the hope of this legislation is that those different pressures will lead to a different outcome and provide an opportunity to profit off of our education system. That may or may not happen, but nothing about this legislation, in my opinion, appears to be in the best interest of students. It appears to be in the best interest of certain for-profit out-of-state corporations that are interested in operating it. So, same as before. I don't think we're probably going to fix that unless we do a repeal. I'm a little surprised we passed it. I'll stop there.
Okay, any other comments or questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, it looks like we're ready for public comment. Anyone? Senator Driscoll, please come forward, identify yourself.
Ogden Driscoll, Senate District 1, Majority Floor Leader. Really short on the comments. First, a big thank you to the committee for passing the bill out. We are a law now, and it's good. And that's, I think Senator Rothfuss brought out a good point. Real short, just a couple of comments on the governor's letter and back and forth. I think one of the things we've got all the way across is, and I'm going to hit it straight on, is charter schools are competition for our existing system, and they treat it as a threat. And that's been part of the problem we've had in establishment is when they come, they really, you know, if I own a campground and I really If I have the hammer, I'm probably don't want another campground to pop up down the road from me. So I think we got some inherent things there, and that's why you move out of the inner circle of education to take a look at approval of this. And charter schools aren't a theory. They're, in fact, they educate many dozens of thousands of kids, probably in the hundreds of thousands nationwide. And they do it in a great way. They tend to excel on the scores, not fail on it. There's obviously examples that don't, but as a whole, they do at least as good a job of educating our kids, albeit in a different way than our rank system does now. So I think it's very well worth your time to let some appear and see what they do. You know, with 90,000 kids in Wyoming, if we educate another 3,000 or 4,000 with a charter school on these three over time, it really is. The other part that we get into, and it goes back to the profit or whatever, I'll be honest with you, I don't think you're going to see anybody doing it for major profit. But I think we've confused dollars with education, and that goes back to constitutionality in the governor's letter. Is the courts didn't say that you couldn't fund schools differently. They said that kids had to get an equitable education, apples to apples. And these charter schools are going to do that. And if they can do it at a cheaper cost than we have now, isn't that what we're here for as legislators, is to get it done as efficiently as we can? Our number one goal should be this. It's not what it costs. And that's what we've had brought at us all along. It's how do we get the highest quality education for our kids? At the same time, we give parents and kids choice. And we've done this with CTE schools. We've done it across the board. And I'm telling you, this is one more tool in it. It's a non-traditional way, but it's an efficient way, in my opinion. And so for those reasons, it's hats off to you for getting it passed out. I encourage all of you not to fight it, but to embrace it. And let's let this go forward and see what happens without redebating it. As Senator Rothfuss said, I appreciate that. Let's get some on the ground. And I think it's clear the bill was needed, because all of a sudden now we've got a renewed interest, and we have people out there right now looking at coming and forming it. And we've got a system in place that says, I really truly hope local boards embrace it. We make it a part of the system, but if not, we have the means to go ahead and get it done. And right now, education's a monopoly in Wyoming. The only choices you have as a parent, if you want choice, existing K-12 system we've got. You can go into some of the alternative schools if you're in a bigger town, but that's not an option in anywhere else. And the third is to pull your kids out and educate them at home. And I think often that's the worst choice. I'd rather see these kids in a social setting. They can do it and do it without being at home. And it's not that they do a bad job at home. It's just socially, it's a big deal. So that's my comments on it. And they're mainly positive for you folks. And hopefully we're back 4 or 6 years from now and saying, this thing's good for Wyoming. It's good for our schools to be able to see another system there. And it's good for the charter schools, our parents and our kids to have choice. With that, I'd stand for questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the committee? Thank you, Senator. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, Steve, go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator. Just so, and you know, I can't remember. I think I voted for this the way it is now, but I think, obviously the issue in Wyoming is our size. You know, it's not like you're in a large metropolitan area. And so, and just like your campground, it takes volume, right? Your Devil's Towers, you get a lot of volume. And you know, half the charter schools close, you know, after 10 or 15 years. We know that nationwide, 1 million kids displaced. But I guess that's part of the governor's letter. I mean, who's going to be responsible? You know, you come in, you start with these deals, and these are out of state. You know, you might sit on a board with somebody, but there's going to be money going to out of state corporations. And we know who they are. I mean, precious school foundation dollars. And how's that the governor, that was probably the best part of that letter that struck home to me. Who's going to be responsible for that? Is it the local school board? Is it the SLIB board? Is it the sponsors of this? And I just think we got to be really, Hewlett High School has probably been there 100 years. Natrona County High School, 125th anniversary. Those are institutions. This isn't about, it's not about, this is about our children. I mean, it's not about, I know we throw out these words, competition and all that, but yeah, I just think, so I think we got to be cautious. And I think this bill is a little cautious. It's got the 5 and then we limited to 3, but I just tell all of us. First of all, we got the best system in the country. Our test scores show it, got the highest graduation rate in the United States. I just urge caution, some of this talk. And I think, so anyway, my question really is, really what the governor asked in his letter. What's the end game on this? One of these, because we know half of them are going to fail. We know that, just studies. We know that across the United States. What's going to happen then, I guess, and maybe we can't predict that, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, committee, it's a great question. I could turn it back on you. Is the alternative is what happens with our existing system, because they can't fail. It's government. And the truth is, for an alternative to come in and do it, the local board's accountable to it. So if it's done in conjunction with your local school board, it's done just the way it is now. It's that they're accountable. If they choose to go down the SLIB route, the accountability is the board that runs the school. And I challenge whether half of them are going to fail in the state of Wyoming. You're right. In some areas, there's been some for-profit type deals, and I hump up on the profit because our K-12 system right now, and this probably doesn't go over well. It's a for-profit system. I see when I sit where I am, our schools are territorial about their $17,000 or $18,000 a student. I hear way more about money than I do about how are we going to do a better job of educating. And I refuse to knock our system. I agree with you. We've got one of the best systems in the nation. It's not that our K-12 system's doing a poor job. The question is, can we do a better job for both them and the charter schools? And I think unequivocally the answer is yes. And part of what that is involving parents to a high level. And that's what you really see in charter schools that I see, is you've got engaged parents, the kids that want a somewhat out of the box different education than they're getting right now in our K-12. And this fills that niche. And I think it truly works. And of course, we already have the schools across. I just drove down by NC and went by your Christian school the other day that does, I don't know what, 500, 600, maybe 1,000 kids here in town. I don't see it as knocking off your system you're talking about. They're doing a great job. They beat them in test scores. And so for me, it's let's get rid of the threat and let's embrace what we can do. And, we'll have some things that work and some that don't. You've got a school just up the road here, that your CTE school, that has kind of struggled. And we do that with new schools. You find a different way and different paths. And that's really what this is. It's choice. It's about how can we give our parents and our kids a better choice of education. And I think this is a fine bill that does that. We got 3 that are available, but we got more. And maybe the local boards, I go back to your little schools. I don't think my local school board, because of the ingrainedness, and I haven't asked them, so I hope I don't offend them. The school of mine, Hewlett, 40 kids in high school now, 45. I think it'd be better off as a charter school. I'd love to see our county say, we're going to turn Hewlett into a CTE school. It tends, ag's our biggest deal there right now. Every kid's an FFA, basically the entire school's an FFA and does ag. I think our school would be great to say, kids in Sundance and Moorcroft, you want to learn how to do some career tech type stuff and turn it to a charter school and tip it on its head, do an alternative way of thinking. Because right now our K-12 system as a whole is directed towards college bound kids. And I'm looking to Representative Nyman, and he can tell you as well as I do, in our community, part of our kids go to school, but very few of them get out. They tend to be right back there in Hewlett, and they're doing stuff. And, you know, the truth is they're probably happier being electricians and carpenters and some of the stuff. Does that fit our K-12 system right now? My answer to you is no, not very well. So.
Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Driscoll, a lot of what you provided in that discussion is based on the idea that this was a choice between having charter schools and not having charter schools, and that either you like charter schools or you don't, and that sort of defines your position on this legislation. It doesn't seem like it's that simple. We had a charter system before, and in fact, my school district has 2 charter schools that went through that process, and I was involved in the second one, the first one more tangentially. It was rigorous. It was a lot of work. The community was heavily engaged. The application process was a challenge because the importance of the decision was so significant that the previous process ensured that there was that level of rigor, and that the local board of education, which was most attuned to the overall education of that population, was the decision-making authority. And at that point in time, there was the appeal process to the State Board of Education if that decision was disliked. My question is, why do we need to effectively lower the bar of what it takes and provide alternative opportunities to sort of get your foot in the door as a way of endorsing or showing our appreciation for a charter school concept? And again, we had this conversation before, and I think you know that I have no opposition to charter schools. I just want to make sure they're really good schools and that they meet the educational requirements and standards that we have, and don't see a path to that through the 5 electeds as well as I do through your local school board. So the question I have, which I think we talked about before, but since we are apparently going through this conversation again, I just want to ask one more time, what is wrong with your school board that they couldn't do exactly what you said? They're elected officials. If your community wanted an ag-focused education, I know these statutes pretty well. You could have an ag-focused education without a charter school, or you could set up a charter school that has an ag-focused education. What stopped them before that having the 5 electeds now opens the door to, other than private enterprise coming in and having some folks from out of state take a profit? I mean, I see 2 things this bill really does. Lets people profit off of education in the state of Wyoming, and lets the 5 electeds circumvent your local school board. How do those enable what we need in education in Wyoming?
Go ahead, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, committee, thank you. I think a couple things come to mind, and I'll back up just a little to your start. Is you talk about rigor in the bar. That's the bar that's been set basically by the education community, and they refuse to look at any other bar and way to look at it. And I think there's more than one way to look at what your actual goals are. Second, back to your local boards, the indoctrination process, and once again, I'm going to wander onto thin ice with some of the people, but immediately when you become on local school board, once again, I look at Representative Nyman because he went there, and they've got a system put together that's absolutely incredible that directs them in. And we have, let's face it, and I'll look the grill in the eye, as the WEA and the professional end of the school deal is it's a cabal that's an unsurmountable hill to some degree to deal with it. So you really have a tough way to get by it. And you know, it's a juggernaut, because if you can't get by the local school board, it's just no, go home. Take your kids out of school, teach them at home, put them to a Christian school. You don't have the good choice, and this does. And yes, it was there. But the State Board of Education is part of the same machine, always has been. That's why the SLIB board's there. This isn't an education decision because the charter itself is what determines what those rigor is and what the standards are. What they are is an arbiter board that says, is the local school board being fair or not? And if they say, we agree with the local school board, there's still not going to be a charter school. My guess is SLIB board is going to be very demanding on what it does, how it goes. My last point as far as the profit. Is it a cardinal sin if somebody makes money off our system if the kids walk out the door with the same education or better? These are my tax dollars too. My concern is how they're spent overall. I agree with Representative Harshman that you need to look and make sure you don't damage the existing system, because when you break it down, then the whole system falls apart. That needs to be a concern. But the overriding concern is, are the kids getting a great education that benefits them and their parents feel like they're getting a bang for their buck? Does it matter if the money just gets however within our system, or if someone else profits professionally managing them, which I don't think is going to happen between you and I. You'll have some money for administration. I think you're going to find that charter schools administer a heck of a lot cheaper than we do right now. We'll find out.
Okay,
But the overriding goal is, are we getting a good education? It's not money. Quit focusing on a dollar bill. Let's focus on the kids and what they're getting out of it.
okay, Co-Chair Scott and then Representative.
Mr. Chairman, I would call attention, because it was the question of smaller districts was raised, to the provisions in the charter school law that we passed that are designed to encourage, give the tribes an option to do one or more of them up in Fremont County. And frankly, Mr. Chairman, I don't know whether they'll take that up or not, but those two districts on the reservation, you look at this, the Y-tops testing, Mr. Chairman, we're not succeeding there. And one of my hopes in doing this, it was if we made it attractive enough, we would get some local enthusiasm up there from either the tribes themselves or some of their members that would say, you know, we can do one that is more culturally sensitive to what the needs of the kids are up there and do a better job. And I would call attention to that because I think that our current system is not succeeding. So I'd like to see somebody try something different. And I think that part of this law allows for a local initiative that, because it would be local and would know what the proper incentives were for people up there, might have a better chance of succeeding, Mr. Chairman. And the problems with those districts are not funding. I think one thing the state of Wyoming can be proud of is that those are among the best funded districts on a per capita basis in the state. And they need it, but it's not working. So I would point that out as one particular area where I think in a particular local circumstance, a charter school might be quite successful, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a quick question for you, Senator. I just heard you say that charters, why shouldn't we give parents and kids the option to educate in a charter school when they're performing at or better than what we see elsewhere in the state? Certainly the national data indicates that some charters are better, or their kids have better scores and others not. And so I'm curious if that was a provision in our charter school statute that they must do at or better. And if that's the case, then honestly, I'm curious about what would happen in my community where we have 2 brick and mortar charter schools One of them, the scores are at or better, the other, it's always at the bottom. And so would we no longer fund that charter school? Those parents fought hard.
Senator, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conley, committee, I'd like to see you turn it back on our K-12 system. Is we got test scores all over the board across the state. I follow them. Some of our schools do phenomenal, some do terrible. Guess what? We still fund them at the same level every year, year after year after year. And so my answer is the one that's doing at the bottom is they really do need to have some type of probably encouragement to do better, because I believe they need to do better. But I also think we need to look inward at our own system and say, what are we doing to make our ones that don't perform? Because we do have across the state, we have schools that perform poorly year after year after year. And, you know, we're not getting that fixed either. So, you know, I think you got to look apples to apples is how do we do this? And absolutely, we want them to do better. And the top end, just like our good schools in the state, I can look up at Sheridan. We got a district in Sheridan that just excels year after year after year. And we haven't spent a wild amount of time trying to figure out why they're so successful. What we do is continue to push the same old funding model the same old way every year after year. So I'm looking at both ends. I look at both what I'm reaching out, trying to do something different. It goes back to the old deal is, you know, what's the fear of going outside of the box and trying to do something in a different way that potentially can give an unbelievable great benefit to our kids. And yes, you may have some kids that don't, on one that fails, that don't do as good. We do right now. I see a lot of kids. I hire a lot of kids. Used to be more when I could do it legally. Hire a lot of kids that are honor students in school that can't count change back, that can't read a manual well enough to figure out how to do things. This is where you see me looking at charter schools is how do we look at the alternative? Not knocking our system. These kids, a lot of them go to 7, 8 school districts. I mean, it moves. It's problems we all deal with.
Mr. Chairman.
Why would you take a tool out of the box and say we're not even going to try? And that's what this is.
Mr. Chairman.
Let's take a swing at something that works.
Follow up, Representative
Yeah,
Conley.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator, we all know that we have charter school statute. We had charter school statutes in our books, and we have both virtual as well as brick and mortar charter schools. We had a system in place. This bill is not giving us an option that we didn't have before. I think we also need to recognize that some charters are successful, some aren't. They're not per se a better choice than the K-12 system. And I think I would be remiss to say that I do not think our school boards are cabals. They just aren't. They are elected officials, they're volunteers in communities, and we can see all over the state where they have rigorous debate and they don't have kind of uniform decision-making. They're not cabals. And I just want to thank all of those who have stood up and done that work.
Go ahead, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conley, I'll make one comment is all on it. And as far as local school boards, I love mine. I think they're great. They do a job and I get it. But they also tend to be any system you're in. I sit on a number of boards and you get on them and you tend to go with what the administration and the people you're working with and you trust them. And a lot of times they're threatened by this. So I understand that the second end of it, as far as we had a system that worked. I'm only gonna make one comment on that. We passed a bill and now all of a sudden we've got great interest in charter schools, and that speaks volumes to me that absolutely we had a system. It did work in certain instances, but it obviously had bottlenecks because Senator Scott's on a committee and we've had charter schools looking at showing up in Wyoming. That tells me clearly that the existing law we had did not cover all the bases. And what we're doing is we're trying to open that window so there is more opportunity. And I think this bill has already proven, even though it's not in effect till July, it's proven that the old law did not cover the bases well enough, because we now have, because I don't think the bill caused these guys to show up. As far as they didn't show up because they said, hey, we got a new bill. They all knew it was there. There was bottlenecks that made them not want to do it because they couldn't work within the system. So I think clearly the bill was needed. Thank you.
Okay, further questions? Yes, Representative Newsom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the credentials of the teachers in the governor's letter, and I voted against this in committee last year. And part of my heartburn was that we spent all day yesterday extolling the virtues of having a well-trained teaching staff and the need for professional development beyond their initial training. And then in this bill, it gave the ability of a charter school to have instructors that are not certified by the Professional Teaching Standards Board. And so that's my heartburn with this particular piece of legislation, is that there seems to be exemptions set forth for teaching certification.
Senator, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Newsom, that was my heartburn as well. And we went a long ways back towards going back to the Professional Teaching Standards Board, a lot further than I'd like to gone. We make an assumption that you have to have a degree to be able to teach. And they've done that, and we're allowed to do some exemptions, and they're doing some more. But often in the case of charter schools, and at least in my end, I was looking back to CTE. I'll use my son as an example, and he's not going to like this very well. He graduated out of Hewlett High School, went to Powell, took every ag class you could take at Powell, went to Sheridan, took their ag classes, and then went on to the University of Wyoming. At which point he came home and quit because he said, Dad, there's not anybody down there that can teach me anything about ranching. They can teach me about the academic end of it, but they really aren't teaching me anything I need to know on the ranch. And that's part of why I wanted to get around that is often, and I look at Chairman Paxton sitting there, and I know he understands this to some degree. Ag teachers sometimes really aren't best guys that came through the education system. They know how to do things to teach kids, do them differently. And all I say is give them a chance on a charter school board to educate kids somewhat differently than the way our granddads and our great granddads got taught. And I'm a believer in that is, we've had in Wyoming, I know we had an engineer from GM at one point in time that tried to teach at one of our small districts and was denied the ability to come in and teach. We have a lot of people with talent in Wyoming that don't have teaching degrees that may end up teaching at some of these schools if you can create the correct exemptions. I'm not saying that they all have to be 100% that way, but I'm asking all the way across to K-12. Look outside of the box, and our system is, you hear about ag, they do it the way their granddad did. A lot of our education's that way. We're really forced into this, and I'm trying to challenge that somewhat. And that's what this bill does to some degree. Just because you have a degree doesn't mean you're a great teacher. And this is really hard for me because it sounds like you're challenging and saying we're doing a bad job. And I'll say it again. I think we have a fantastic system in Wyoming. It's not a broken system. And that's not why I'm trying to do charter schools, is to dismantle or claim they're doing a bad job. It's to give choice to kids and parents that want to take a slightly different track than we do now. And I think this bill's going to do that. I think long-term, we're on the road. Senator Rothfuss was correct. The proof will be in the pudding 3 or 4 years from now. I mean, they're a 5-year term on them. Either we're out there and this is working, or we say we learned from something and we'll do it differently in the future. My prediction is, looking at the charter schools I've looked at, it'll be a mixed bag, but you're gonna have some of the top schools in the state will be charter schools 5 years from now. They're gonna be turning out some really high-end kids. That's what I want, and I want us to look at that.
Any other questions from the committee? Yes, Ocean.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Driscoll, on the topic of out-of-state corporations, wouldn't you agree that already built into the current system, there are plenty of opportunities for out-of-state corporations to profit off of our education system? Unless all of our textbooks, our software, our curriculum, everything is homegrown, we must be sending our money to out-of-state corporations to be able to acquire this stuff. Thank you.
Senator.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Andrew, fully agree. There's a lot of money goes out of state, out of our system now. It's, if you want to enlighten yourself, and maybe you guys get it, but take a look at the contractors that we do, particularly with federal money. That thing's a book this thick, and they're big, and a lot of them are out of state. So no, we do it, and people profit off education. It's one of them being my daughter and my brother-in-law both work in the system. They profit off of it. They help make it better. It's like I said, I keep going back to, let's look at kids, not at dollars. It's, you focus on the dollars and you're going to forget what you're trying to do. And your core deal is how do we educate kids the best we can. And I think we all find in anybody that's run a business, the harder you work, the more successful you are, as long as you're focused on what you're doing. And that's really the focus needs to be kids, not dollars. We spend a lot of time fighting about how do we fund something when we really ought to be looking at how do we do a better job of educating.
Other questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Harshman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator, and to the good representative's point though, and I think though, my point, I don't want this to be confused with buses or books or any of that. I'm talking about the management. I mean, I'm talking about the board and where the end game this goes. That's what I'm talking. I'm not talking about the local administration, and those folks are in our state. I know that, but this is different. And we all know that. And then in the end, and it's in the governor's letter, who's going to be responsible? Is it the top five? Because it's not going to be your local school board. It didn't go through them. And I think in the end, somebody's going to have to answer that. And it's not going to get answered today. I know we're putting a lot of faith and we've got a hope on this deal. But, you know, fair enough. Just know that that's out there. And it hasn't been answered yet. It can't be answered yet. And so as we move forward, we'll see how it goes, how it works. But again, this isn't about pencils and books. This is about the guys running the show and managing. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator.
One last and I'll leave. Food for thought. Back to the question you just asked. I spent 8 years of my legislative term doing accountability bills that we ran. We spent thousands of hours and endless hours of debate on that very issue, because the truth is we went beyond the local school boards to try to bring accountability back into law. And it was one of the most colossal failures I've ever seen. We found out that it's really hard to make accountability by statute. And I think you'll find the same here. The accountability will go back to that board. If the SLIB board does it, if there's a board that runs the school, the accountability falls there. That's the board of directors is the board. They hire and fire the principals and do the people, and accountability lays directly there. And that's where it will fall. And the pressure is immense. If they're failing, I can assure you, if you've got charter schools that aren't doing good, they're going to take a lot of heat. Representative Conley alluded to that. I happen to know the one that's done poorly in her district is they're under fire a lot, because you got to get yourself brought up to it, because you're going to be held in a charter school to a different level of accountability than our existing system. Everyone's going to expect them to do better. They don't expect them to be average. They expect them to be better, or at least I do. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Yes. Representative Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Driscoll. I appreciate and support this legislation, and I in my tenure as a parent, grandparent, served on school boards, business owner who's hired people, hired our young that are leaving our system currently. I don't have heartburn with competition. I think competition is something that we owe our kids, and the opportunity to be able to provide them those choices and that ability to be held to a standard to say, hey, listen, if you're not doing it, you don't get to keep the job. And I'm concerned as I've watched, and even previous to this meeting and stuff, but primarily previous to this, there's this concern out there that we're somehow going to undermine or destroy our current system. And to me, this doesn't do that. This provides an opportunity to give everybody an incentive. If anything, truly, this incentivizes excellent performance. Because in business, when I'm in business, if say you've got two different outfits that are fixing tires in your community. One person that you can take your tires to 60% of the time, when you get back to the field and you unload that tire, it's flat. Or you can take it to another person down the road, maybe a greater distance away. It isn't always convenient, but you might be able to go farther away. And 98% of the time, that tire is inflated and you go on. Where do you take your business? And that's how they survive. To me, I look at our responsibility, or my responsibility on this board, or any time as a taxpayer in the state, is to do the best job I possibly can to provide education opportunities for our young, a quality education. If that would be in the public school sector, then that's awesome. I'm a product of the public school system. But I know in business, and I don't believe that education is any different, that competition and that ability to give people choice and to take their business where they see the best and most return on their dollar, the best benefit, encourages those that are not doing, let's say, a lower standard or a lower level of quality to come up, because I've got to raise this or I go out of business. And to me, ultimately, our job here is to do the very best job that we can to educate kids for our future, for our state and our nation. And if providing this opportunity is going to provide those choices to try to encourage others to take a different look, and I believe Wyoming is a state of innovation, to take a different look. And as far as equality, I was listening to that. I went and looked at a facility last night that I would give my right arm to have in the northeast corner of Wyoming. But that's not available to us. I have to drive 200 miles to come to that facility. So that's not equality in education, quality of opportunity. So as far as that's concerned, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But if we can provide these opportunities in communities and allow folks to make these decisions and provide this opportunity for these kids to get the best education they possibly can, it's good for everybody involved. I appreciate your work on this, and I support the legislation. I'd like to see it going forward.
Yes, don't you agree? All right, any other comments, questions from the committee? All right, do we have anyone else who'd like to testify at this time? Yes, come forward, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Kari Akins, Wyoming Department of Education. Wanted to just give some brief comments to update the committee on the work of the department to implement this bill. And then also, I guess, to steal a couple of words from your co-chair, a couple of glitches that we've identified that might this committee might want to contemplate. So this bill does require the department to have a uniform application for the charter schools that would go through this process, and actually for all charter schools. So work on updating that application, as well as a scoring rubric has been underway. Also, we're working with the Attorney General's office on drafting a charter contract template that would align very well with that application to make that a swift process upon approval. And then also we've identified the appropriate rules chapter and began working on revisions there. We have a meeting scheduled with the Office of State Lands and Investments to make sure that there are good processes for the interaction between our agencies. And then also we've communicated with some state authorizers to learn about their processes as well. So this is all still fairly preliminary work, but in digging into this bill, there are a couple of areas that we think that this committee should contemplate. So using the materials that were provided, which is the engrossed bill, if you go to page 6 of the bill, so this is 21.3.304 and then paragraph D. The first sentence says a charter school shall be administered and governed by a governing body in a manner agreed to by the charter school applicant and the authorizer. In speaking with,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, could you give us that number and go a
sorry,
little
it is,
slower on
yeah,
that?
it is
please,
page
just
6 of the engrossed bill.
Thank you.
So we're in 21.3.304 paragraph D. And it is the first sentence of that, of D that I'm looking at. And the key phrase is a charter school shall be administered and governed by a governing body. And in speaking, in just researching charter schools and in speaking with some national charter school associations, the administered and may not be appropriate. Governing bodies typically govern and they hire the administrators. So it was a little bit unclear to some of the folks we talked to if you're requiring basically one of the hired administrators to then sit on the governing board. So deletion of administered and may be appropriate. So then it would simply read a charter school shall be governed by a governing body. So that just maybe, yes, Mr. Or is there a question?
Go ahead.
Chairman. As I'm reading this, that is in the existing law that we've had for years.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we realize that, but it was brought up to us by several people when they were looking through our statutes for charter schools. So that's why bringing it up is just something that this body may want to contemplate. Additionally, in looking at that paragraph D as a whole, it goes on to talk about how a charter school may organize as a nonprofit, and then it adds a sentence that says a charter school organized by a school district may include school board members or school district employees on its governing board. And just in researching charter schools across the nation, we are aware that in some situations, governing boards do receive a salary. And so we were thinking through all of the potential ifs, ands, and buts of these situations and identified a potential conflict of interest if you have an elected school board member that is serving on the governing board and then receiving a salary for serving on that governing board. We just were unaware if that scenario had been contemplated by this group and if that was a possibility that the body wanted to be allowed.
Go ahead, Senator.
And Mr. Chairman, frankly, I was involved in writing that. It is a little different. We really did not contemplate there'd be any salaries involved for governing board members. But the reason we put that in there is we could see, we thought that a charter school might well be a vehicle for a school district or combination of school districts to do something innovative and where the charter school is potentially sponsored by a district. And I think that might well happen in some of these smaller districts. We thought that under those circumstances, it was appropriate for the elected school board to have some of its own members on that charter board. So that's why that is there. I don't see the conflict of interest provision. I just don't see that. But it does seem to me that it's a device where a district that wanted to support a charter school, that wanted to have its own charter school, would maintain a degree of additional control by having a board member. So that's why it's there.
Okay. Yes, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to think through. It seems like the topic of my interim has been, we have a statute we delegate authority to agencies to write rules to fill in gaps. And then there are questions about the gaps. And I just think, we could tinker with the first sentence of paragraph D to say a charter school shall be administered by administrators and governed by a governing body. That's a solution, right? Then we're making a distinction that they're two separate things. But I think, so my question is, can you do that in rule? The second part would be this language, a charter school organized by school districts, may include school board members of school district employees on its governing board. In your rules, could you say, so long as they are unpaid or uncompensated board positions, so as to prevent a conflict of interest? I just think this is starting to become my new thing, is I think we've delegated a lot of authority to fill in the gaps. And the process is that agencies and our commissions with the proper rulemaking authority, they draft those rules, they go through a public comment period. And then the legislature, we get a crack at looking at all of that, especially this committee, those would come across our desk. So I'm just wondering, can we maybe accomplish some of these tweaks through rulemaking?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Senator Ellis, I think that would be appropriate. The reason why we bring these forward are because these were areas that in the discussion of this bill, there seemed to be no contemplation of these things. And so we were unclear what the intent behind it was, or where, just because often we base our rules on the intent of the legislature. We really do try to put rules in place that follow what this body wants. And so these were areas where we couldn't find any guidance on that because it just did not seem to have been contemplated. So even just that direction is very helpful to our staff. And then, Mr. Chairman, I do have one more area, which is on page 18 of the engrossed bill. So this is 21.3307, and then this is also paragraph D, and it is the very last sentence of paragraph D, where it says, if either party refuses to mediate, the dispute may be appealed to the state board as provided in Wyoming statute 21.3310. However, section 4 of the bill repealed 21.3310. So we're assuming that's just a technical oversight. And potentially just a simple deletion of as provided in Wyoming statute 21.3110 would fix that. But and then we could just provide that process of mediation in our rules. But we were unclear how to deal with that issue.
Mr. Chairman, I can
We have,
respond to that.
so
Tanya Heitrich, there's a process, the revisers bill. That's not the only reference. As you stated, this is a very complex piece of legislation. We do bring a bill separately through the legislative process. We're tracking those. I think there's actually a couple of references to 310 that we'll have to address in that bill, but a separate bill is not necessary.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chair, did you have a comment?
Mr. Chairman.
That answer your
She
question?
said what I thought she was going to say.
Okay, all right. Okay, go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman, that is all that I have for you, unless there's any other questions.
Okay, questions from the committee? Yes, Representative or Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you for coming prepared and coming through the legislation, and that's super helpful. Thank you, Kari.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I would echo that, and it does seem to me that two things. One, as you go through this and look at it, if you find other glitches, Mr. Chairman, I hope you'd be welcome to come back to the next meeting and tell us about them, because that's one of the purposes for having this subject on our agenda. Second, I think my thinking is that the ones that you've been identified, the one technical thing, I think the LSO has also found and will take care of with the reviser's bill. The other two do seem to me like we can live with for now. The business about do you pay the board members or not? I do think, Mr. Chairman, if there really is a problem there, you can deal with that in the rules. Say that a school board member or a school district employee can't get additional compensation. for serving as the school district's representative on a charter board would be one way to handle that. The administered and issue that was raised, it looks to me like that has not been a problem in the existing law, that you can construe that as simply you administer it by hiring somebody to administer it. I guess that I suppose Snowy Range Academy in Laramie probably does it that way. They have people that are hired to administer that work for the board. I think probably we can simply construe that that's all that's doing is authorizing you to do that. If you continue to feel that's something, then if we have, say, a corrections bill, we could delete those two words perfectly well. But I don't think, Mr. Chairman, it rises to something that would require us to bring a bill to a budget session. And I think we have to be a little careful about how much we bring to a budget session, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, anyone else? You have anything else? Thank you. Anyone else like to testify at this time? Yes, please come forward and identify yourself. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have served on your committee about 8 years, a few years ago, quite a few years ago. And we started out today with with a new concept that has not been, but it's being thrown around. Excuse me, I think I'll prefer to be seated here. That we've considered new things back when I was chairman of the committee, and I always like to bring in new ideas. It's fun, isn't it? Aren't you enjoying your time here listening to all the debate? Because this is a kind of new concept, and always looked for a challenge. And this is one that I have decided to be a part of. I don't know why I'm doing it. Just last week, I turned to be 89 years old. I should be by the beach somewhere, but instead, the subject is so exciting to me. And that's what I'd like to share with you. Just a few ideas that I think are good. It is a new idea. You're going to find things in it that you may not like. But listen to the debates. In fact, I have had the opportunity, I'm on a board right now to create a charter school in Cheyenne. And I have talked to numerous businessmen, women, people who are in the community who have looked forward to the success of our educational system. And as a result of that, I have found a large number of people who are very excited about this issue. There's a lot of it I don't know about yet, but I'm trying to learn all I can as you're doing the same thing. And I appreciate that so much because this is what makes our system work so well in America. We're getting away from that a little bit, but it's still, right now, it's true here because all of you are here to be what's good for our children and other things. And so I don't have the bill. I haven't had a chance to read it. I will. I haven't read the governor's letter. I hope I could get a copy of it. I couldn't hear when it was being read because I want to know the best thing for our kids. I had that same desire about 15 years ago when I was serving on the education committee. we did things that was changed and different. Now, we have a coach up here. Coach, I'm sure in your experience, you don't use the same plays every year that you coach, right? You change those plays. You change the way you do certain things. So that's what you're doing now. You're kind of coaching here, and you'll be changing things. Some of you I've already heard said, no, it's not going to work. It's unfair. It'll create other problems. But I think when it all boils down, each of you will see that there is a need or a desire, maybe more than a need, more is a desire, as I've expressed. The number of people that have told me they really like the school that is being created by this piece of legislation. I had a long speech, real long, but I decided that you need to hear from other people other than me. But I hope that you'll consider this. I hope that you'll be willing to listen and hear us. I'd like to speak again when I have a little more time to give some consideration to this. But we now have a board. It's official board. It's been approved by the Secretary of State. And so we're on the roll. And you're now on the roll too. And I hope we all roll in the same direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to speak kind of off the cuff. But it's good to see many of you that I've worked with. Mr. Scott, I'd like to know, how long have you served in this legislature?
Go ahead, Mr. Scott, Senator Scott.
Oh,
Mr. Chairman, I'm in my 43rd year. And I recall you as being one of the leaders in the education area when I came in.
that's right. We came in about the same time, but I got out a long time ago. Thank you very much, and our very best to you as you wrestle with these tough issues. Thank you for allowing me to speak, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your testimony. Yes,
Mr. Chairman. Speaker McElwain, just wanted to thank you for being here and really a lifetime of service. So really appreciate your service. So
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
It was great experience, and
Who are Mr. Speaker, who are the governors that, because you served like in the one term and then you came back.
Yes.
Who are the governors you served with?
I served with Governor Hathaway for a couple of terms. And then I went to Afghanistan, believe it or not, where I helped start a school there. And then I came back and I served actually, I have served 20 years in the legislature. I served 15 years as a lobbyist for the small schools of Wyoming, which was a whole new concept back then. And so that's what I've been talking about. But let's see, the other governor was Governor Sullivan. And Governor Sullivan, he was of the opposite party. But I tell you, he and I never got to the point where we were angry or upset with each other. He was very willing to sit down and listen to my point of view. I listened to his point of view. And it turned out that we both were pretty successful in our efforts during those days. And I served with Mr. Scott many, many years, over about 20 years, I think I served with you. So.
Yeah, well, sure appreciate your
Thank you.
service. Thank you, Speaker.
Appreciate your work.
Okay, any other testimony? Yes, please come forward. Identify yourself.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association. I really did not intend to say anything today, but after some of the comments that you heard, I think it's important that there's some response to some of that. The first thing that I would say is that I find it offensive and repugnant that there would be insults of locally elected officials. To say that a school board is scared or unable to make decisions or things like that are just flat out inaccurate. They're offensive in my view. Mr. Chairman, I think there's a number of misunderstandings about how charter schools work in Wyoming, about the history of charter schools in Wyoming. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, we've had approximately 10 charter schools apply in Wyoming. 6 of those have been successful. So we do see that most of those that have applied have been successful, and they serve wonderful places in our Wyoming school districts. And so when they are denied, and Mr. Chairman, I personally have been through 3 of those as a board member, and I voted in favor of 2 and against 1. And I think what happens is that there is a rubric. There's a list of what a charter school must do. And if that charter school application meets the rubric, then the board must grant the charter. If it fails to do so, the board must tell them why. And Mr. Chairman, I wrote findings of fact and conclusions of law for the first charter school denied that went to the State Board of Education and was appealed by the State Board of Education. And the comments from the state board at that time were, wow, these are very extensive comments. You've really laid out why it is that you denied, and then they reviewed those. They gave that its review, its due diligence, and made a determination whether or not that was an appropriate decision by the local board. And so our process that exists today, well, actually before this legislation, is a process that allowed good charters through, and it said to other charters that you need to make some tweaks. There's some things that you need to fix. And in my observation of those, I will tell you of charters that have made application, it's not hard to come up with a good educational idea. As a matter of fact, I think everybody who's been in a classroom has ideas for innovations in education. The reality about them is that it's hard to figure out the business side of a school. How do you make it financially viable? How do you come up with your HR policies? How do you do the things that make the charter school go from idea to reality? And that's most of the time where we've seen deficiencies in applications. So under the system that we have, we had the ability for charters to exist. And I think we have evidence that boards have found, local school boards have found those to have a good place within their communities. Now, there certainly are some concerns that we have with regard to charters. Number one, a charter board is exempt from public meeting laws. So when we talk about the expenditure of public dollars and we talk about the desire for accountability of those public dollars, the charter board doesn't have to be accountable to the public. They're exempt from public meetings. There are some of the accountability requirements that we have concerns about whether or not those are the same for charters outside of a district. Clearly, when they're within the district, those are a part of the district's accreditation and a part of the district's responsibility. We do have some concern about those outside. But again, Mr. Chairman, I hear these inaccuracies about, oh, if we wanted to turn Hewlett School into a charter school, then that would be a great thing to do. Under our existing statute, that's just flat out impossible. Our statute says that it is prohibited to turn an existing school into a charter school. So if that's something you want to change, you can change that. If you want to change financial efficiency, there's currently a double funding of charter schools in their initial time. Their startup time, they get double funded. That's a part of helping the charter school to come into place and to be successful. That's a part of the system that we had before. But I think if we're going to talk about charter schools, we really need to have an accurate understanding of what happens, how it works, why it works, or perhaps why it doesn't. If there's a desire for another authorizer, I guess we'll find out if that's a good idea or not. We were opposed to that initially. We had no intention of talking about that today. But I hear these inaccuracies talking about charter schools, and I just really encourage the committee, if you're thinking about making some additional changes, to make sure you have the background around how it happens so you can make the best informed choices about going forward. As far as I'm concerned, charter schools are a great thing that have a great place in Wyoming. They serve a great place in Albany County, in Laramie County, in Fremont County. We've got really wonderful charter schools that have served Wyoming kids well. If we want to have some more, I think that would be wonderful. But I agree with the rubrics that are in place as to what a charter school must do and how it must demonstrate that. And back to one of the questions that you began with, at the end of the day, the charter is a contract between the authorizer and the school itself. And so if you're going to change one of the parties to the contract, or if you're going to authorize an outside entity to perform under the contract, that's usually addressed within the contract itself or would be done by way of amendment to the contract. So it's a system that I think we've worked through for a number of years. It works pretty good. If we can tweak it and make it better, I think that's fine. We can certainly do that. But I just hope we have the right information and we talk about our present situation as opposed to this idea that charters don't exist or that we're somehow just brand new bringing them into Wyoming now, because that's I think not respecting the charters that do exist and the role that they've played in Wyoming education today.
Yes, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to offer, that was one tweak that this bill made, was if you look at page 7, going on to 8 of the Enrolled Act, nothing in this subsection shall be deemed to exempt the charter schools from the Public Records Act and public meeting requirements applicable to public schools and school districts, and any federal or state privacy laws applicable to public schools or school districts. I just want to make that clarification, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman.
yes, go ahead, Representative Sommers.
Mr. Chairman, originally when this bill came, it struck out, if you look on page 7, it struck out G, which was basically the oversight of regulations at the state level. Could you kind of go over, this is a question I had last session, but I really didn't know the answer to. Could you just kind of go over, a charter school doesn't have to follow the same regulations as a normal school, but it has to go through a process to get away from those regulations. Could you just delineate that for me? Because it's not clear to me. I read it, but I don't know in practice how it happens. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, so really charter schools first came about in the nation in the 1960s or so to say, hey, if we got rid of some regulation, would that innovation lead to better education, with the notion that maybe then we could get rid of those regulations for all other schools. And so the idea of removing some of the barriers is a central part of charter schools. In Wyoming, we used to have the system where the charter school was required to meet all state and local requirements unless exempted. So an example might be under HR rules, if there are rules for human resources and they did not want to follow that rule in the charter, then the charter would make an application to the Department of Education for an exemption from that specific rule. And then the department would either grant or deny that application for exemption from a particular rule. By taking out language about that, it would then be presumed that they don't have to meet those requirements that you would typically find in WDE rules for human resource administration, for teacher certification, for curricular requirements. And so I think that is then removing their need to make application to the department for a waiver of a rule and then the approval that would come from that or denial.
Mr. Chairman.
Follow up?
Yeah, follow up, Mr. Chairman. So actually it's the state board. So they have to apply to the state board. So I was just curious in the two that you were involved in that you passed, whether you guys actually asked for some relief from regulation and how that process worked with the state board, but maybe you just didn't do it, so you don't know.
So,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, actually, the rules depend on whose rule it is. If it's the state board's rule, for example, a rule for accountability purposes, might be their rule, whereas another rule, say for transportation, might be a WDE rule. And so it would be incumbent upon the applicant, the charter applicant, to request that waiver. And so in the processes that I was involved in, the charters that I was involved in, applicants did make a petition of the rule entity, both the Department of Education, the state board. Some were granted, some were denied.
Okay, further questions, comments? Okay, thank you for your testimony. Anyone else? Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, do we have anyone online?
No, we don't have any online testimony.
Okay, thank you. All right, I guess we're to a point now where we're at directives from the committee. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, one thing that was mentioned in this discussion was the PTSB. That is a professional licensure board. I would just suggest to members of the committee that sooner or later, we're going to probably have issues that relate to them. My recommendation is to any of the committee members that, as that comes up, read the chapter in Milton Friedman's classic book, Capitalism and Freedom, on professional licensure and how that works and some of the problems. I found that to be quite useful. So I just mention it now because that sooner or later will come up, Mr. Chairman. It was mentioned here.
Okay, directives from the committee.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I just wanted to offer, I've been in touch with someone from the Daniels Fund who has offered to help provide tours to members of our committee to some charter schools in Colorado. Because we're meeting in Cheyenne on November 15th and 16th, which are on Monday and Tuesday. The date would be November 17th. Certainly that would be a non-mandatory event, but I think it might be interesting for committee members that want to learn about charter schools. I think being in Cheyenne, I often visit with friends that come up from Denver, and it is just so different to hear when they talk about where their kids are going to school and what their choices are. In visiting with a friend just this past weekend, they looked at different elementary schools and ended up at a charter, and it was just fascinating to hear just the options they have available. So for those that want to participate, I will happily send out an email. Would like to gauge your interest, and so we can make it worthwhile and make the right accommodations. But I just wanted to put that out there for committee members, November 17th.
Okay, thank you. All right, do we have any directives? It seems to me that we're at a point where probably none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know how this is going to turn out. And we are plowing some new ground here. And from my perspective, it seems that our best course of action at this point is to let it play out and see where we go from here. But personal opinion.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
The only thing I see is I think we ought to explicitly invite the Department of Education to speak to the chairman ahead of time, and we'll put them on the agenda if they find a major glitch that they think needs a legislative fix at the budget session.
I think that'd be good. Great. Okay, yes.
Mr. Chairman, this isn't a directive to the legislative staff, but, in the letter, the veto letter, I've read it several times. And, there is, I think, a willingness among legislators to fine tune this bill, but one area is, I think we need some guidance. A lot of thought went into the statewide, what an appropriate statewide authorizer might be, being the SLIB. And you'll recall when we discussed this in our conference, the reason that we wanted a statewide entity was then we could limit it to the number of 3 as more of a pilot program to see how it went. We always hear that the current system's fine. Well, this is a bit of an experiment to say, are these 3 new authorized under a separate authorizer. Let's get their feedback about how this process might work and fine tune it. Another option we discussed was county commissions, but we rejected that idea because it would be difficult to put a limit on that number. So I just wanted to refresh our memory of why it ended up being the SLIB. So if that's not the right entity, which I still feel comfortable with, you know, a different, like, I think someone's got to put some meat on a proposal. But the thing I want to address most is the constitutional claims. I am by no means an expert when it comes to equal protection and education funding, but everything I anecdotally look at, court cases and articles online suggest that, you know, that's the reason I got behind this bill is I think we're fine. So to the extent that we want to keep talking about this issue, it might be wise for the executive branch to seek a formal opinion from the Attorney General's office. And to the extent that we need to make some adjustments, go from there. But I don't, you know, that's just beyond my bandwidth and I'm sure LSO. So to the extent that that keeps coming up, I just would throw that recommendation out there, obviously non-binding from a lowly senator from Cheyenne, just sitting with a microphone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Looks like our next topic is K-12 school finance, and Mr. Carroll, Chief Operations Officer, come forward, please. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Paxton, Trent Carroll, Chief Operations Officer, WDE. And I'm joined today virtually by Leslie Zimmerscheid, our School Foundation Program Supervisor. If staff can admit Leslie to the meeting, please. Mr.
Carroll,
Chairman.
Been admitted,
Okay,
but her audio and video are off until she.
thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, we appreciate the opportunity today to share a little information with the committee about school district cash reserves. And we did provide a memo, should be in your meeting materials, that you can follow along as I briefly walk through this information. So a little bit of background first. There are three mechanisms that school districts in Wyoming can use to maintain savings or reserves. And those three categories are the general fund, reserve account, the special reserve account, and the building fund. And the WDE does not regularly collect information on the special reserve account or the building fund. So the focus of my presentation today will be on the general fund, account. And we will walk through the calculation that goes into the determination of the general fund account balances, including the exclusions that we factor in, and then a summary of the calculations for the most recent year, fiscal year 20, you will find in attachment A. So all school districts maintain a general fund account for their main financial operations. And districts are allowed to maintain a general fund operating balance up to 15% of their computed foundation program guarantee. We review this information annually and calculate the applicable general fund balance at year end based on the audited financial information that we receive from districts each fall. And we perform that before January, end of January each year. Amounts that are determined to be above the 15% limit are considered to be state revenues. And we factor that into the entitlement and recapture payment calculations for the current year. So, Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, there are certain exclusions included in this analysis. So we exclude the following categories. I'm going to walk through these in more detail here in a minute, but the categories are the federal impact aid money that some of our districts receive, the pre-1997 cash reserve balances, funding for a 1999 half-day kindergarten error, and a special appropriation for that, and then protested tax revenues. The first category, impact aid. The federal impact aid program provides payments in lieu of taxes to school districts that have large parcels of federal land. So this could include Indian trust or treaty land, also our military base, and other federally owned parcels of land. In fiscal year 20, there were 10 school districts that reported impact aid balances, and the total there was just under 100 million at 99.4 million. Federal law requires that impact aid funding be excluded from local fund calculations. And in the material that we provided, you'll see a little more information there about the United States Code.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. On the federal impact aid assistance funds, I know that those have to be excluded when we calculate our local revenue, but do we track the expenditures out of that account and what they ended up, or those accounts, there's several of them, and what the cash flow to and from those accounts is, or do we really just track the balance?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Office, I'm going to ask Leslie to answer that question. I don't know off the top if we have a special fund code for impact aid.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman, we do not track their expenditures, and we don't keep track of any sort of cash flow for those accounts. We only receive the end of year balance for the impact aid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick follow-up. Are there federal requirements on what those funds are expended for, I assume, with the impact aid assistance, or is it pretty broad?
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that there are some restrictions, but I do not know what they are.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The pre-1997 cash reserves, these of course are the balances for fiscal year ending June 30, 1997, and they're excluded until fully expended by districts. The balances are not accounted for separately in the school district audited financial statements, and the previous year's balance is carried forward to the following year for the cash reserve calculations. So therefore, these amounts are only reduced when a district's fiscal year ending cash balance falls below the amount carried forward from the previous year. You'll see in attachment A that for 1920, there were 40 school districts that reported pre-97 balances totaling 45.7 million. The 1999 half-day kindergarten error. So in 2002, there was a special session and an appropriation of $13.9 million to address a funding error for kindergarten students in the 1998-99 year. This was a one-time appropriation, and these amounts have been excluded from the cash reserve calculation since 2002. And then the last category, protested tax revenues. And these are revenues from settlements of protested taxes, and they're excluded for 1 year following the fiscal year that the revenue is received. And school districts are required to notify us of any protested tax revenues, I think within 30 days after the end of the fiscal year. And then those also have to be certified by the county treasurer. So, Mr. Chairman, unless there are any questions, we can move to attachment A.
We have any questions from the committee? All right, I think we're ready.
Thank you. And so, Mr. Chairman, attachment A is really just a depiction of the calculation in action. And so you can see there, if we just look at that first district on the list, you'll see their guarantee amount for the 1920 year. We start with their unrestricted general fund balance, and you'll see that number there. The next column shows the legal restrictions that are accounted for. This district did not have any impact aid, but if they did, you would see an amount reflected there. You will see some if you look further on down the list. And then we have the column for the 1997 reserve balance. This column would include the pre-97 and the 1999 kindergarten error, both of those combined. And then that final column would represent the net balance that is subject to the 15% limitation. So that's how we work through the calculation for each district. So, Mr. Chairman, that's everything that we have. We'd be happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Okay, questions from the committee? You must have done a great job.
All right, we're maybe a little early, but it might be appropriate to take a break here. Let's take about a 15-minute break and then we'll come back and resume our agenda.
Looks like money.
Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order again. Next item on the agenda is consideration of draft legislation 22 LSO 105 WD 0.5 school finance increasing cash reserves. Tanya, do you want to talk to us about this just first a bit?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, this bill is pretty straightforward. At your last meeting, you requested that staff prepare a bill increasing the cash reserves for school districts from 15 to 30%. That is time limited. It begins in funding fiscal year 22-23 through 2026. I can go ahead and walk through the bill if you'd like to. It's fairly straightforward. On page 2, lines 6 and 7, this is a conforming amendment to authorize the operational language found later in the bill. On page 3, lines 21 and 23, and on to page 4, lines 1 through 14. This is where you'll see the operational language that I discussed, that for funding year 2022 through fiscal year 2026 allows for the cash reserves for school districts to be increased from 15 to 30%. There is a provision that prohibits the expenditure of these funds on capital construction. And I think that term is defined on lines 12 through 14. As you can see on lines 16 through 19 of page 4, the bill is effective immediately. Subject to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for LSO? All right,
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
seeing none, I move that we
We want to-
introduce 22 LSO 0105 as a committee bill. And Mr. Chairman, if I get a second. I'd like-
Second.
Okay, a second. Like to explain. Mr. Chairman, this recalibration, and it was originated in the House, this concept. When we looked at it in conference committee, I think the Senate posture was that the House got this one right, and we agreed with you. So it's, I think, non-controversial that way. And basically, the key here is that we are facing tremendous uncertainty of as a state in terms of our financial situation. And in education, that's compounded because there's a good deal of uncertainty regarding what's going to happen with the federal stimulus monies, how that's going to play out, and the various maintenance of effort and whatnot requirements that we've got there. So, Mr. Chairman, it seems to be unusually prudent to have cash reserves wherever we can get them, including at the district level. And that's what this does, is for a period that would carry us, we hope, beyond some of the current financial uncertainties, but we can always extend the date if we have to. Just doubling the amount of reserves they can carry seems to many of us to be a prudent thing to do. The whole thing's not been tested before the Senate, but I don't foresee any difficulties in passing it through the Senate. It makes sense. It's been through the House as part of your recalibration effort. Came in as an amendment, did it not, Mr. Chairman? And so for those reasons, I urge us to just go ahead and adopt it. I don't think it is substantially different from what passed the House. Is it? It's virtually the same, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
No, Mr. Chairman, it is the same. And just remind you, you didn't take public comment before you moved the bill.
Okay,
So we can take public comment before we act on it.
Yeah.
And Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I had a personal bill as well that was just like this. And then in the end, I didn't run it onto the floor. Because then we'd been debating the same thing twice because it was in the recalibration bill. So that's why it never came up. But I too support this idea. It just, if some of the federal money does go down to districts, then it allows a time period for that to work its way through the system. So, but I certainly think we do need to take public comment.
Anything else from the committee before we take public comment? All right, public comment. We're open for public comment. Public comment, don't see any. Oh, maybe we do. We've got a taker.
Mr. Chair, Janine Bayteski from Teton County. I don't need to say very much because Co-Chair Scott said basically what I would have said to testify. In the times of uncertainty as we are, I think enabling us to increase our reserves is probably a good thing to do. Thank you.
Okay. Any other further comment? Public comment? Oh, okay. Janine. You're still on the hot seat here. Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Teskey, just, the 15% obviously is in there for cash flow, and every district's different, timing of ad valorem payments, and some are recaptures, some are not. And so that 15% is really critical for the payment piece and cash flow. And we have that, with all state agencies. But my question really, this idea of 30%, let's go back a little more history of this, was really the idea of the ARP funds. We have these ARP funds, and the ARP funds have not been distributed. And I guess my question to you is, school districts aren't a bank, right? You're supposed to spend that money on the services of children.
Yes,
You
sir.
do that. I understand the 15% to keep that for cash flow. That's necessary. But wouldn't this bill, I guess maybe we could amend some language in there that if the ARP funds becomes effective, when the ARP funds become available or distributed to districts, that's really the idea, is to save this one-time infusion of cash for the next 5 years. Not just to say, hey, we're going to start cutting services. Because see, like Senator Beitman said yesterday, where the district's pocketing the money. That was the quote, pocketing the money. Well, they're not. I mean, the model, 38,000 for a beginning teacher, like in Sheridan 2 or 3, and the base is 45. Well, they got to get that money somewhere, so they hire fewer teachers, because you're not going to get any teachers at 38. They're going to go to somewhere else. They're going to another state. And so this is the issue we're in. And I guess my point is, you need this extra 15% if you don't get the ARP funds to close out that narrative. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I
Go
think
ahead.
the answer to your question, Mr. Chair, Representative Harshman, probably not. I will say though, and this has always been sort of troubling to me, is if you look at good accounting practices, they will tell you that your cash reserves should at least get you through 2 to 2.5 months of your operating budget. At 15%, I don't believe that does that. I've been told that ours needs to be in the neighborhood of 20 to 22%. So is 30% the right number? I don't know. I think I read this bill, I guess, perhaps incorrectly, just that this was an implied, that the ARP funds were the causal factor of this, and that as the ARP funds evaporated from the system, that this would go back to the 15%.
Mr. Chairman, and can I follow up, Mr. Chairman? Follow up. Thank you. And so, and you used to be involved in running a large multi-billion-dollar big company, I think. I don't know all that, but
I did.
And I just, and don't get me wrong, if we don't accept these ARP funds and figure it out, somebody ought to be impeached or somebody ought to be defrocked or something. I mean, holy smokes. I mean, we'll figure that out. I have all confidence that this will get done. But I just want us to make sure we kind of know what we're doing. I guess we're doing this for a reason, not just to say, hey, hard times might be here. Although I think when we see October Craig, we're going to have a pile of money, but So start saving and cutting services. That's not the message that I want to send, or I think the colleagues sitting up here. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, Representative Harshman, to that point, I think it needs to be, I hope the committee understands what indeed these ARP funds are intended to do and what some of the, I think you do of all people, because you live this world with us. We have students that we need to bring back up to par because of the time that they missed from the classroom. We have been hiring nursing staff. We are, I think, now, I can't tell you the budget for the ARP funds. I can tell you the budget for the ESSER funds up to this point. We're spending about $1.8 million on staffing, 2-year staffing positions that perhaps will be extended if the ARP funds go forward to counseling, nurses, extra teaching staff to help bring some of these kids back up to par. Some of the protective gear that we need and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like we're just, oh, well, good, we got rich quick, we're going to just take the rest of it and we're going to put it in the bank. I mean, there's normal operating stuff that needs to happen with our original block grant as well. And this is, I think COVID has put extra duty upon us that these funds are being used to pay for.
Okay. Anyone else? Welcome.
Morning, Chairman Paxton, committee members. This is Dennis Holmes, Associate Principal, Campbell County, or Associate Superintendent, sorry, that was a past role. I too, on the surface, do support this legislation. Personally, I wonder why a sunrise and sunset, but I can also kind of understand that. I also agree with Representative Harshman, some of the points you made there. Cash flow wise, for the past 2 years when we were a recapture district, cash flow was a very crucial issue for us in Campbell County. Now that we're an entitlement district, it's still an issue. So this will certainly help us. I also agree that this is not a money in the bank, cash buildup opportunity. This is essential for general operations and the maintenance and sustaining those operations over a period of time. So I do support the legislation as is. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, public comment is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I did move the bill previously.
Yes, been moved. Yep.
Mr. Chairman, I would add one thing. I think this is broader than just the various federal stimulus funds. This is as representing a community that makes its living off the oil and gas business. There's tremendous uncertainty on the revenue side as well. We may do very well. We may do very poorly. It depends in part on what some of the federal judges do about some of the restrictions that are coming on our ability to drill new wells, which we need to replace the production as frac wells fall off faster than conventional ones do. So I think that this bill is a good idea, independent of the federal stimulus, but the federal stimulus does add some impetus to it and may make it easier for some of the districts in particular to take advantage of this.
Representative Harshman, I had first.
Go ahead.
Okay. Representative Sommers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I just received an email and it reminded me that we did pass Senate File 60 and there is some debate on how that timing of mineral taxes is going to come in and how that may affect the 15%. And so I think besides the issue of the ARPA money, I think it'll alleviate some issues until we get Senate File 60 worked out as well.
Representative Harshman, did you? Oh, okay, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I do think this is a good piece of legislation. But I think that because of the ARP funding, I have concerns of the idea of having the reserves grow substantially based on model revenue, because we've calculated the model funding based on what is supposed to be given in any given year to the student's education. So if you are filling your reserve from model produced funding, you are effectively shorting that year's students relative to an equitable distribution, and I would be concerned about that. So in the past, I've generally opposed increases of the reserve account because I don't think it's appropriate to be filling reserves with this year's model produced funding. In this case, I think it's drafted in such a way where it is short term, but hearkening back to what Representative Harshman was discussing, where restrictions could be provided to ensure that it was filled up with ARP-backed funding, would be something that I would support. I think that would help to assuage the concerns that I have regarding how it's filled. So I would support that type of a concept as it was presented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, anyone else?
Question.
Okay. Well, yep, if you're.
Mr.
you have a
Chairman,
minute.
yeah, and I'm not sure where the committee, but that is a concern because government isn't a bank. And particularly school funding, because that's based on the number of customers, flat out. And so I don't know how you would put that in section 2. I think the 5-year thing does kind of calm some of that, but I do think, if we had some language that 16 to 30% piece, which is already has prohibitions on construction and those kind of things, that be a prohibition on that they should be these stimulus type one-time federal dollars. And I don't, whether they're ESSER funds or ARP funds, but though I just don't think those should be model funds. And really, I don't think districts want to go down that road, because then a new group of legislators are going to sit on this panel and say, well, geez, not even spend the money you got. You're just saving it. And so I just don't think that's, and this is a debate we have, Mr. Chairman, all the time about whether we use today's dollars for today's people, or we use today's dollars for something in the future. So Mr. Chairman, I think I can propose a concept amendment that would basically make that 16 to 30%, probably be at the end of section 1, put another prohibition basically that these be those federal stimulus one-time funds, and that'd last for the 5 years. And I think LSO can draft that.
Matt, you have a comment?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman, currently all federal funds are excluded from this calculation. In fact, the only reason why the impact aid funds are included in a district's operating balance for the general fund is because there is not many restrictions associated with those dollars, but every other federal dollar that is received by a school district that has restrictions are recorded in their special revenue fund, which is not part of their operating balance or general fund under this section of law. Additionally, the ESSER funds, whether it's ESSER 1, ESSER 2, or ARP ESSER, are provided to school districts on a reimbursement basis. So districts actually have to expend those dollars first, and then they draw down the reimbursement from the Department of Education. And so by operation of how that funding works on the ESSER funds, they are not counted amongst the district's operating balance under this section. So there isn't a necessary exclusion for those funds in this section of law.
Okay, I'll withdraw my amendment. I don't think it's necessary then. Thank you.
Co-Chair Scott?
No,
You okay? Yeah. All right. Anyone else?
Question.
Question's been called. All in favor signify by saying.
Roll call.
Roll call.
Oh, roll call. It is roll call, isn't it? Okay, roll call, please.
Thank you. On 22 LSO 0105. Representative Sommers.
Aye.
Representative Obermuller.
Aye.
Representative Newsom.
Aye.
Representative Nyman.
Aye.
Representative Harshman. Representative Connolly. Representative Brown left a proxy vote aye. Representative Andrew. Senator Salazar. Senator Rothfuss. Senator Ellis. Senator Whitman.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Scott.
Aye.
Chairman Paxton.
Aye.
All ayes.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, would you like that to be House or Senate?
Let's, Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, my thought on that is that we ought to see after the next meeting, a total workload, and then have the chairman divide it up, House and Senate, so we have a relatively balanced workload. So, Mr. Chairman Paxton, my thought is that we ought to defer on whether it's a House or a Senate.
that sounds reasonable. I think we can do that. All right. Where are we? Next item of business is the Hathaway Scholarship Program. Review information requested at the last meeting. Leanne and Matt, are you ready to present?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Leanne Hoag, LSO. I will be going over the memo titled Hathaway Student Scholarship Program Questions. And this memo serves as a response to multiple questions that were proposed at the last meeting. So walking through the memo, the first question is if the amount that was transferred to the Hathaway Student Scholarship Endowment Account, or the corpus, from the Hathaway Student Scholarship Reserve Account was halved or reduced by 50%, how much could have been used for the Hathaway Scholarship Award increases? So there are two pieces to this question. The first is the amount of money that has been transferred from the reserve account to the corpus. And since 2008, that amount is $115,472,757. So reducing this amount by 50% would have left approximately $58 million in the reserve account. The second piece is that with this reduction, there would also be a reduction in the investment earnings that were received year over year. So tables 1 and 2 on page 2 provide two different analyses on the reduction of investment earnings. Table 1 uses non-compounded yield, which essentially excludes unrealized earnings. And table 2 uses total return, which includes those unrealized earnings. The difference in this estimate, and you can see this in the third column, which is titled Estimated Investment Income Attributable to a 1/2 spillover, is approximately $2 million. So with this associated decrease in investment earnings being between 18 and 20 million, the net impact of a reduction is between 37 and $40 million. So that is the funding that would have been available for expenditure on award payments. So if you're looking at $40 million for round numbers, future scholarship awards would have increased one time at 10%, and that would be sustained for 20 years. This is not sustainable beyond the 20 years because the funds that are expended are no longer available for investment income earnings. Moving on to question 2 on page 3. This addresses the impact of changing the percentage cap on the reserve account from 4.5% to either 6% or 9%. So table 3 identifies those differences in the cap amount, as well as the difference between the cap amount at 4.5% to 6% and 9%. And essentially what you're left with is that modifying this cap results in a policy trade-off, where an increase will sustain payments for more years underneath poor investment conditions. However, it would also lower the long-term investment earnings that could have been deposited into the corpus. Looking at the bottom of page 2, Table 4 prevents this trade-off, and this is using the January 2021 Craig estimates. So what would happen is underneath a 6%, you would receive 1.4 years of additional scholarship protection and an anticipated $110,000 reduction in investment earnings per year. And underneath 9%, you would receive 4.3 years of additional scholarship protection and an associated $330,000 of reduction in investment earnings per year. Moving on to question 3, which is on page 4 of the memo. This addresses the expenditure timing challenges within the current Hathaway account. So there are 3 areas in which there are some timing challenges. The first being the timing of investment earnings, not aligning with the scholarship award payments. So essentially, the expenditure account depends on earnings from the corpus throughout the year, and it's deposited throughout the year. And this does not align with the requirements for when scholarships are to be awarded, which is outlined in Wyoming statute 2116, 1312, paragraph D, subsection 4. And that identifies that scholarship awards are to be certified by the state treasurer no later than September 1st for the fall semester and January 15th for the spring semester. The third piece of information that produces challenges is the timing of the transfers between the accounts. So Wyoming statute 2116, 1302, paragraph A requires that at the end of the fiscal year, the unexpended unencumbered funds within the expenditure account are to be transferred to the reserve account. And further, Wyoming statute 2116, 1302, paragraph B requires that as soon as possible after the end of the fiscal year, any amount in excess of the reserve account cap is to be transferred to the corpus. So what happens is the investment earnings for the associated fiscal year are not fully realized at the time of payments for the expenditure account, which causes the transfer from the reserve account to the expenditure account and then potentially back to the reserve account. Moving on to question 4, this identifies the percentage of students that receive a Hathaway Provisional Opportunity Scholarship that have been awarded certificates or degrees. It's important to know that the percentages in table 5 on page 5 only represents the number of students that are using the scholarship through the time of their attained certificate or degree. So students who had the Provisional Opportunity Scholarship and lost it either due to eligibility or to timing out that did also receive certificates or degrees are not included in this table. It is also important to note that the italicized numbers in the tables represent years with incomplete data due to just the timing of when that cohort started and not having attained their certificates or degrees at this point. And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Yes, Representative Sommers.
So, Mr. Chairman, let's spend a little more time on table 5 because this is the issue I raised. And so what year, so if you're a cohort year of 15, let's say, and you were assuming you maybe get through all of your college if you were to go for a bachelor's in 5 years. So basically that 14, 15 year is a year that you could assume that the student may have kind of got through. You'd really a 6 year, the data goes to a 6-year cohort, right, as well. But you can kind of look at that and see, we have 28% got so if you add that all up, if you add all of those up, you'll see what percentage of student got some kind of degree, right? Unless you go out to a 6-year cohort. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers, that's correct.
And obviously we didn't ask you to look at this, but it does appear that over time that this cohort of scholarship recipient has done a better job of graduating over time. That's what I would say. So I think that, alleviates some of my fear that maybe that scholarship is not doing what it should be doing, but it appears we're having more success with. Is that something you're seeing in that data?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers, based on what data we do have, it does appear that that has increased over time. Obviously, the last 5 years are incomplete at this point, but trend line up to that point, yes, I would say that's correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Matt, are you next?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything else to add to Leanne's discussion. I would say on question 3, there's probably more discussion to occur on that, whether the committee wants to modify existing accounts. I do know we have the state treasurer's office in the waiting room online. They may have some comment on some of those timing challenges, but I'll address any questions that the committee may have as this conversation continues.
Okay. Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and Ms. Hoag, I think really great job on this. This is a great piece of work. And then to table 3, that's page 3 of 5. And question 2, and then you have table 3 and table 4. And again, I really appreciate your work on this. I think there's 2 issues here, the reserve account size, and we've generally been increasing the size of reserve accounts a little bit. Then we've come up with Amendment A where we can invest some of that so we don't lose that opportunity cost. But I think then the other big part with this is the timing. And I think it's just so important, I think. And if you want to, Mr. Chairman, if Ms. Hoag could talk about really on question 3, and it flips over to page 4, these timing challenges. I just want us to all be really clear what happens on July 1st. And then when do revenues actually start filling up the expenditure account for the bill that's due on September 1st or sooner, actually, but no later than September 1st. And I mean, I think I could say it. I guess I'll just say it like this and you correct me. First week of July, that money is swept. It's swept out of the expenditure account and goes to the reserve account. Anything over the cap from the reserve tips into corpus. So there's no money in the expenditure account. It's not until the second week or third week of September when all the investment earnings goes through all the process from the previous fiscal year that it hits the expenditure account. So there's $0 in the expenditure account when the bill comes due on September 1st or earlier for the kids going to college. There's no money in the expenditure account. So then a reserve account flips back. It draws down from the reserve account to the expenditure account. Then the money comes in late September from the treasurer's office, fills that up, then tips back into the old reserve account. And so then it creates this thing, and you've maybe heard this narrative. Geez, the Hathaway's going broke. We don't have enough money to pay our scholarships. The Hathaway grew by 100 million last year, the corpus. It's not going broke. This is a real timing issue, and I think we can simply fix it by moving these tips to October. First week of October, second, let that, and it's not going to hurt filling of anything, but it's going to make the cash flow thing match what's necessary. That's how I see that is, and I guess I'd ask LSO to correct me or fill in any missing parts. That's my 6th grade view of it.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman did a good job of, I think, articulating some of the timing issues. I would say just clarification on this, on the expenditure account on receiving investment earnings, that occurs throughout the fiscal year.
Yeah.
It doesn't occur on September 1st or at the beginning of the fiscal year. It occurs throughout the fiscal year. And so the requirement is at the end of each fiscal year, the expenditure account, that unexpended, unencumbered balance is transferred to the reserve account. And then the reserve account is also tipped into the corpus if it exceeds the percentage of the 5-year market average of 4.5%. So there is this challenge of cash flowing the expenditure account when it doesn't have any funds in it to pay for the fall semester scholarship payments. And so the reserve account buttresses that expenditure account throughout the year to ensure that the cash flow in the expenditure account meets those scholarship payments. At the same time, it's receiving throughout the fiscal year those investment earnings. One option, and this is for your consideration, is to just combine the reserve account and the expenditure account into one account. So you don't have this shifting of funds back and forth throughout the fiscal year. You would just look at the combined balance. You could be one account or look at the combined balance of the two accounts as your 4.5% spending policy, or as the bill draft that you'll look at later is 9%. So rather than having the treasurer's office move funds back and forth throughout the fiscal year, you could just have one account, whether you call it the expenditure account or reserve account, and use that as the only account that would then be tipped over to the corpus. I hope that didn't confuse the issue more. Just wanted to fill a little bit more information on that.
Okay, appreciate that. Does that make sense, Steve? Okay.
Absolutely, Chairman. There's a couple ways to fix this problem, and that's certainly one of them we talked about in June, frankly, and depending on where the committee wants to go, but okay, thank you.
Okay, are we ready for consideration of the bill? The next item on our agenda is consideration of 22 LSO 0104 WD 0.5 Hathaway Scholarship Award increases in account transfers. And Tanya, you're up.
Mr. Chairman, again, this bill is pretty simple. It increases the Hathaway Scholarship Awards across all categories by approximately 5%. We did round up, I think, to the nearest $5 or $10 amount. And it also increases the amount that's retained in the Hathaway Reserve account, as the amount was just discussing with Representative Harshman, from 4.5% to 9%. It also deletes obsolete language related to the $12 million cap. The bill is effective July 1st of 2022. I can go ahead and walk through page by page or line by line with your direction, or perhaps that explanation is sufficient. The one item I would, I think that's it. That's it with this bill. Sorry. It's on to another bill. So if you'd like me to walk through it page by page, line by line, I can certainly do
Please
that.
do.
Okay.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. My apologies, but before we get to the bill, I did have one more question on the memo as we were transitioning topics, and my apologies for kind of falling behind on that, but it's table 4 with regard to the reduced investment earnings per year. And the calculation there, I think I'm missing a little bit how that's calculated. If we look at the 9% in the lower right, a reduction of 330,000 would seem to imply that 330,000 would be the revenue off of, looking at the previous table, around $30 million a year. And I don't see how we would only be getting $330,000 differential of revenue off of 30 million as the split between equity investment and what is effectively dividends and interest for the state agency pool. So an explanation of why that number is only 330,000, I would expect it to be substantially higher.
Leanne or Matt?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, we're reviewing our spreadsheets on how we
Gotcha.
calculate that. I believe we only use the interest to dividends. We did not anticipate any realized capital gains, but we'll get you a figure here in a second.
Thank you.
Okay. And you want to continue to walk us through?
Sure. Back on the bill, on page 2, lines 17 through 19. This is deleting the obsolete language that I mentioned, referencing an effective date of July 1st of 2007. And then also on the bottom of the page, line 23, that also is deleting the reference to the greater of $12 million. That's obsolete. The controlling amount is what currently is the 4.5%, which you see on the top of page 3, lines 1 and 2, that's stricken. And we've inserted the 9% as directed. Moving on to the actual awards of the scholarship on page 4, lines 4 and 5, this increases the Hathaway Opportunity Scholarship from $840 to $885 each semester. And then page 4, lines 17 through 19, this increases the Hathaway Performance Scholarship from $1,260 to $1,325. Moving on to page 5, lines 7 through 9, it increases the Hathaway Honor Scholarship from $1,680 to $1,765. The provisional increase can be observed on page 6, lines 6 and 7, from $840 to $885. Moving on to the need-based scholarship on page 7, lines 10 and 12, it increases the need-based scholarship from $1,575 to $1,655. And on line 16 through 18, increases the minimum need-based scholarship award from $105 to $110. As I noted, the effective date can be found on page 7, line 22, and that is July 1st of 2022.
Okay, questions for Tanya?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and I certainly think we need to increase the amounts here with the degree of inflation that there's been in the college expenses and the general increase that there's been in inflation. What I'm having a little trouble with is correlating the effect of the bill to the tables that are shown on the memo on the questions in the finances. And we'd like a little guidance. If we do this, if we do this, what are we going to, what impact are we going to have with the contributions to the fund?
Okay, who wants to answer that?
Mr. Chairman and Chairman Scott, so the impacts of the bill, if you look on page 3 of the memo, look at table 3, the bill increases the cap of the reserve account from 4.5% to 9%. And so in the far right column, you can see for estimated fiscal year 2022, if this bill were made effective immediately, not July 1, but immediately, the reserve account cap would increase $27.2 million. So it's unlikely at the end of fiscal year 22, if this bill was made effective immediately, any excess revenue in the reserve account would be tipped to the corpus. So you can see that's estimated out through fiscal year 2026. As the corpus market value increases, the reserve account cap also increases. And you can see the far right column is the difference between your current policy approach of 4.5% and 9%. So on average, about $30 million increase limit to your reserve account. So that's the first impact of this bill. The second impact is you're increasing your scholarship payments by 5%. That'll be about approximately $1 million per year.
Representative Harshman, are you done? Are you okay?
We're gonna build.
Okay. All right. Follow up, Senator Scott?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, so we're increasing the reserve account. Mr. Chairman, we're increasing the reserve account by about 30 million total. Is that that's basically a one-time thing that creeps up gradually as the corpus increases, is that right?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, correct. So you're permanently changing the percentage of the reserve account balance from 4.5% of the 5-year market average to 9%, but it does increase gradually because it's based upon the 5-year average of the market value of the Hathaway corpus. And that's anticipated. It's anticipated increase because the market value compared to the end of fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 16 has increased. And so as the years go forward, the market value, the 5-year market value average increases because it's using a higher value than the prior years.
So this is a ceiling on what's in the reserve account, not what's actually predicted to be there. Is that correct? Or have I misunderstood this?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's accurate in that it is a limit, it is a ceiling at the end of each fiscal year of how much can be retained in the reserve account. The current balance is approximately $26.3 million. And you have, by this bill, you would increase the amount that could be retained in the reserve account by approximately $30 million. So you're allowing additional revenues that would have otherwise tipped to the corpus to be retained in the reserve account to be utilized to cash flow the Hathaway scholarship expenditure account or to pay for scholarship payments in years where the investment earnings are lower than the actual payments.
Representative Sommers.
Mr. Chairman, now I think that the last statement's the big one, is you can have a couple of years where it goes way down. You got to have enough in your reserve account to pay that bill until you get the good years. We know 8 out of 10 years it's good, but 2 out of 10 it's not. And if you go to 3 or 4 years in a row on a down market, you need to have a reserve account.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. Representative Sommers, right now, it's projected that the 4.5% provides about 4.3 years of protection of years where investment earnings may be less than what actual expenditures could be. Increasing to 9% allows a total of 8.6 years of protection in your expenditure account.
Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
Is that before or after the effect of the increases that the bill is proposing?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, it's before the additional 5% increase to the scholarship payments.
Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this year analysis is based on at least dividends and interest on earning 2.1 or 2 or 3%. And of course, if it's zero, I mean, if we have some bad years, it's zero. That's my first question. So if it is zero, you can basically say it's half that. Yeah, but is that correct?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman, correct. So the forecast includes interest and dividends of about $13.5 million per year that will be earned.
Okay. Other questions before we go to public comment?
Mr. Chairman, so we're 13.5 million is the estimate of revenue from interest and dividends. What are our annual expenditures going to be with and without the 5% increase that the bill is proposing?
Mr. Chairman, throughout the forecast period, it ranges between 17.5 million to 18 million per year. And so based upon the bill, the 5% increase would increase the expenditures from approximately 18.5 million to 19 million per year. Recall, the revenue forecast does not anticipate any unrealized or realized capital gains or losses. And so it's only the interest and dividends that are being forecast for the revenue to the expenditure account.
Okay, follow up?
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, we're anticipating that we increase to 9%. That will prevent tips for this for a period of time. Is that right?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and Sen Scott, correct. It would anticipate, unless you have a phenomenal year where you would have in excess of, where you would cover your total expenditures about $18 million. You would fill up the cap of an additional, $30 million. You'd have to have in excess of $48 million of returns or investment earnings to tip at a 9% cap. That makes sense.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's filled up now at 4.5%, 26 million, and it would add basically another 26 million. So it would take 1, 2, 3 years. We've had some unbelievable years, but it probably a couple, 2, 3 years before it tip. But I think so that's it. And then I think, we could put some amendment A language in here. So we invest that to get a little better return too. I think as we look at bringing this down the road, but yeah, absolutely. And if 9% you think is too high, I think 6%, maybe somewhere in the middle, but I think a little more than 4.5 for sure.
Okay. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, and I mentioned it, and this is a policy decision on this bill draft. As it's currently drafted, and I think you can make this specifically to the provisions of the reserve account increase, is this bill's effective July 1 of 2022. If you want that reserve account increase to be made effective immediately, meaning that 9% cap be effective for the end of fiscal year 22, that provision would need to be made effective immediately. If you make that provision made effective on July 1, 2022, you potentially, and this is a policy call, you could potentially tip additional dollars to the corpus that would otherwise have been captured with a higher reserve account balance. So I just bring that as a policy consideration for the committee.
Okay. Anyone else from the committee? Okay, public comment. So yes, come forward, please, and identify yourself.
She's going to talk on any Hathaway issue.
Anything on the Hathaway issue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Lisa Johnson here on behalf of the Wyoming Association for Career and Technical Education. Our 260 members are educators at the secondary and post-secondary level, and we're interested in the increasing access to the Hathaway Scholarship in a little slightly different way. Instead of increasing we support increasing the amount of the scholarship, but also having access for people that are in a program like a registered apprenticeship program that may have qualified for the Hathaway Scholarship. But for an example, an electrician apprentice at Casper College is working and training for about 40 hours a week, and then they're taking 5 or 6 hours of college classes. Well, they're not able to use the Hathaway Scholarship for those college classes because it's not considered full-time. This bill, the Hathaway is structured so that a student has to be considered full-time, taking at least 12 hours to access the Hathaway dollars. And so we'd like you to consider adding some flexibility so that students that are taking a registered apprenticeship program could access the Hathaway. And the credits for apprenticeships vary. For that example, it was 5 credit hours, but they're probably less than 12. However, they're doing a work-based learning opportunity that is definitely full-time. The other thing is for someone to achieve a journeyman apprenticeship level, that could take 4 years. And so there's also a limitation on the number of years that people can use. There's a, they only have so much time to use their Hathaway dollars. So if you were able to add that flexibility for that type of a program, it would address some of those issues that were brought up in the memo in that table 5, where you're looking at a pretty low percentage of people that are getting those certificates. This might actually show that people are achieving they're getting those certificates, and it would increase the level of people that are reaching a education at that, I'm sorry, I'm struggling. It would increase the people that are using Hathaway and getting those credentials.
Go ahead, Representative.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thanks, you mentioned this last night to Chairman Paxton, and he mentioned it to me, and I wanted the whole committee to hear this. I think it's a really good idea. And I asked staff to pull up the statute for me. And it really says, with the Hathaway Opportunity Scholarship, $840 per semester at an eligibility if enrolled for 12 or more semester hours. It also has a B, which is the amount provided under subparagraph A of this paragraph times a fraction, the numerator of which is the number of hours for which the student is enrolled, and the denominator is 12, if enrolled at an eligible institution for at least 6 hours. So 6 is still the barrier for a student in this opportunity. And so I think what we need to contemplate, at least what I'm going to suggest in either an amendment to this bill or in a separate bill, is that we move that down, to just I don't know that there needs to be more than 1 hour, right? I don't know. And I'd certainly invite, I think besides you, I'd be interested in what the community college people think about this issue and how we can make this better. So really appreciate you bringing this issue, and I think we'll have a good debate on it. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes. Representative Harshman.
Mr. Chairman, and I agree, and I think this is a little glitch. And in the Wyoming Tomorrow bill that we'll look at later, that is in there. It doesn't set a floor at 6. It just says, that the denominator is 12, and the number they're enrolled in, it's the numerator. So that's an easy. I think we can fix that and do some good.
Okay. Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. There was a piece of legislation that was drafted by the Wyoming Tomorrow's Task Force a couple of years ago that simply allowed for the Hathaway funds to be effectively on a debit card, where you earn them and you spend them how you see fit over basically as many years as you want. And that's an alternative consideration. And Representative Paxton and I had a bill like that 8 years ago or something that had some cash flow problems, but then we never brought it back. What do you think, and I think you were involved in the work that we did there, what do you think of that approach as opposed to just changing the denominator, but allowing the folks to get the provisional opportunity, for example, to just have that amount available to them to take classes when they have the time available, whether it's 5 hours or 12 hours or 15 hours? Would you see that as it's obviously harder work and a heavier lift for the committee, but it provides more flexibility? What are your thoughts on that approach as opposed to just tweaking the denominator here?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Senator Rothfuss, I appreciate that question. I think our complete objective is just to provide options and greater flexibility for students. I would want to get some more input from our members on what might be the best approach, and we could certainly get some feedback, but I think the flexibility is the key there. So I'd be happy to get more information.
The challenge with just changing the denominator is that the amount of money that's provided for the provisional really doesn't pay for the credit hours. It's a pretty small amount of money, and same thing for the standard opportunity. So if you change the denominator, then you just divide and you have 3 credits, then you just get a quarter of that amount for those 3 credits. And, you're getting to the point where you're not paying for very much. So I would ask that you kind of contemplate that, touch base with your community, and it might be more valuable. Again, with Co-Chairman Paxton, the concept years ago was just to recognize if folks want a 2-year certificate, let's just make their life easy and give them the availability of those funds for a 2-year certificate, instead of requiring it be used over 8 semesters where they don't need 8 semesters to do what they want to accomplish. So yeah, I would ask for some follow-up, give that some further consideration. That's a legislation's already drafted. Would be easy to drag back up if we wanted to go that route. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Okay, public comment still open? Anyone? Whoever gets up here first. Yeah, you both come up at the same time. That'd be great. Okay, please identify yourself. Tell us who you represent.
Chairman and committee members, I am Dr. Sandy Caldwell. Good morning, co-chairs and committee members. I'm Dr. Sandy Caldwell. I'm the executive director of the Community College Commission.
Mr. Co-Chair, my name is Kyle Moore from University of Wyoming. I serve as the Vice Provost for Enrollment Management.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, in reference to the question that Representative Sommers asked if the Community College Commission on the prior topic of the apprenticeships, this would be a welcome. We certainly are focused on ensuring that our students have access and options, as you heard Ms. Johnson talk about. We'd be happy to help on that language. We as well would, however that might work as an adjustment in or a tweak in this particular bill or in another bill, as long as it provides those options for students, that's what we would be interested in. So does that answer your question, Representative Sommers? This is an important educational tool, and these lead to careers that we are looking for. I do have some other comments related to this bill, if I could bring those up. This has to do with the amounts that are listed, and this has to do with the financial aid offices. And it also ties to some federal legislation that we're watching. So I want to kind of cover both of those things. The award amounts on page 5, page 6, and page 7. And I'm going to start with page 5, and it proposes an increase to $1,765. And that's not divisible by 12. And that is a problem for the financial aid offices when they are doing the awards amounts on proportional basis to that. So in the past, most of the time they've been looked to be divisible by 12, so that makes the packaging of the students on their financial aid work without getting into the cents part of the amount of funding. So it's a small change, but it is something that we wanted to bring to your attention because it actually occurs in all 3 of those amounts, which is why I wanted to point those out. That 1,765, the next number that would be divisible by 12 would make that 1,776. What I will share with you, because that's an option, is we are watching the federal legislation around America's College Promise very closely, and we'll be talking about that later on in another bill that you have up. For the community colleges, the 12 credits is right at 1,800 across the colleges for the 12 credits plus fees. So 1,800 could potentially be, if you wanted to roll that up, then you would also be meeting that provision that is probably going to, it is written in those bills right now. So that is one option. I also wanted to share with you is the state will have met a portion, at least on the traditional age students, of the free community college aspect. So it's going to help on the eligibility of the state to meet the requirements of those funds. So that would be on page 5. Right now it says 1,765. Divisible by 12 would be 1,776. And to meet that free community college as proposed in the America's College Promise bills, that would be 1,800.
Representative Sommers.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. On the 1,800, does that, obviously that's just one of the scholarships we have listed here. So does that still make you eligible for the money, even though it's only one of many scholarships here?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers, we do have a follow-up conversation with the people in Secretary Cardona's Office of Post-Secondary Education. They're wanting us to get back with them as soon as these bills that you're contemplating today, so that we can make sure everything is going to work for the state of Wyoming. So right now, the answer is, I don't know. I do think that we could propose that option to them, particularly with the funds that are coming in, or the way it is written now, who knows how it'll pass, but they are first dollar. So that would maybe fill that up.
Co-Chairman Scott, I believe.
No,
isn't it?
go ahead.
Oh, okay. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Caldwell, will you remind me, is 12 hours, the $1,800, does that then buy you full-time so you can have more credit hours up to an overload in the community college system, or do you have to pay still individually above the 12th credit hour?
Go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, what you were talking about is a cap. Is there a tuition cap and everyone after that? That was removed. So they do continue to pay up to. We do know that in the federal legislation, they'll be using the benchmark of the 12 credits, even though they still want to see 30 in a year to lead to completion, but they do have the opportunity for the summer Pell. So we do not have a cap any longer. That was removed, but the 1,800 and the 12 credits will still be the metric that is used for the federal.
For the federal funding. Okay, Mr. Chairman, quick follow up on that. And so that we're on the same conversation, I believe the same is accurate with the university, where we still have incremented payments all the way through. There's no maximum cap we had 15, I think. No, we had 12 at one point years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Is that true?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, you're correct in that.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, the final point I'd make, and one of the concerns is, I'll just ask the committee to recall that when Hathaway was put into place, you were buying into a full time and you could actually get your full 30 credit hours a year times 4 years, 120 credit hours was contemplated Hathaway at that time. So one of the effects over the years that has taken place is this is contemplating 12 credit hours. You can't graduate taking 12 credit hours for 4 years. That doesn't get you done. So that has kind of decreased the value relative to the tuition cost for Hathaway further than just the erosion of the buying power due to policies that are, I think, are pretty commonplace. But I wanted to make sure that was still the case and make sure the committee understands that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Co-Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I have both a very general question and a very specific one. Let's deal with the more specific one first. I flat don't understand why the divisible by 12 is important to you. And it's been a while since I had great involvement in this kind of thing. So if you could explain in simple language, Mr. Chairman, I would appreciate it.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I could respond to Senator Scott's question. It comes down to to two things. Really comes down to the ease of packaging by the financial aid offices to use a round number rather than, in particular, a repeating decimal. It also reflects more cleanly on the student's bill, allowing them to more readily see the cost owed. So if I could maybe bring your attention to page 4. If we looked on page 4, line 18, the existing dollar amount of $1,260 would be divisible by 12, coming up with $105 per credit hour. In particular, when you have students who are taking less than that 12 hours, that is a nice round number by which we could package. In addition, federal aid dollar amounts are always, they always have a round number to them. The proposed dollar amount of $1,325 would create a new individual per credit hour dollar amount of $110.41666 out infinitum for a repeating decimal. We, particularly at the University of Wyoming, have no recommendation of what the dollar amount should be, simply a friendly recommendation that whatever a dollar amount is considered by this committee, it would be divisible so that we get rid of that repeating decimal.
As I understand this, you have to be enrolled for 12 or more semester hours, right? Or do you not have to be enrolled for 12 or more semester hours?
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Scott, you do not have to be enrolled in 12 hours to be eligible. And that is in particular where the this issue of being divisible by 12 comes into play. So a student who is taking 3, 4, 5 hours, when we prorate the total award eligibility down to those individual credit hour numbers, that's where we get in particular into these repeating decimals. And that's where the challenge. As you have heard, there are a lot of students who don't take full-time, or because of their particular life situation, they need to take fewer than full-time credit. This would allow us to administer the aid more cleanly and provide them a more consumable bill statement.
So we're using 12 as the basis for figuring the credit per credit hour amount. So we're dividing this figure by 12. And so that's somewhat arbitrary, but it works a lot better if it is evenly divisible. That's what I'm hearing from.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Scott, you're absolutely right. That's
You've got it.
perfect.
Mr. Chairman, forgive me for trying to figure it because I was having trouble with it.
No problem. And you had another question?
Yeah, my other question is much more general. As originally conceived, the Hathaway was designed to be designed to be assistance for the average student who was capable of doing college work. It was designed to be an inducement to those students, enabling them to go to go to college where they hadn't maybe been able to before. And it was designed to be an inducement for them to take a more rigorous course in high school, which was the debate over the success curriculum. The evaluation I saw that was done a few years after we passed it was that what it was doing, it wasn't affecting the best and the brightest students we have. It was useful to them, but they had enough other scholarship opportunities. It wasn't really affecting them. But what it was doing was taking a number of students who had been only able to afford to go to a community college and moved a number of them to the going to a 4-year institution, at least for the last 2 years. Some of them probably for all 4, but some of them just for the last 2. And it was moving a number of people who had had to quit just at the high school diploma level and enabled them to go to a community college where they had not been able to before. So it was achieving those objectives. What's happened is that when we initially did it, it wasn't quite up to the tuition amounts at the two institutions. The top level was very close to the University of Wyoming tuition and fees. The level for the primarily going to community college was close to the community college tuition and fees. But now I understand we've had just one increase. We've had quite a bit of inflation. And we are at a much lesser percentage. 60% sticks in my mind, but I'm not sure that's at all right. Of those figures, and the middle level of the Hathaway is somewhere between. The question is, are we starting to lose the incentive that we had, the boost to the people's ability to further their higher education, because the award amounts are so much smaller compared to the expenses which have inflated. And I'm particularly concerned when we start to hear proposals to broaden the Hathaway, that by accommodating everybody, we're going to lose the gains that we did produce with the Hathaway when we first put it in. I'd like to have both of you, what do your institutions feel about that? What are you seeing in terms of that? Is the Hathaway still having an effect on what the individual students are doing? And is that effect eroding? Because,
Okay, go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman, I am concerned about
Who wants to weigh in first?
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Scott, I think in the interest of brevity, the answer is yes, it is still having an effect for students. It is valuable for those students. It does encourage them to attend and in fact transfer. So the challenge we do have is when we are looking at the amount, you are correct at how, it's why we're talking about potentially if you were to select the 1,800, but the short answer to your question is yes, it does have an impact at the colleges.
Sen Summers.
So, Mr. Chairman, I got a couple of questions. One is the unique thing about the Hathaway, it's not unique to the Hathaway, but it's one of the few that's the first dollar in, right?
Yes.
So we could change the Hathaway to be the last dollar in, but then who's the first dollar in, right? And so talk to me a little bit about that. And then the second question is, this whole divisible by 12. So when I go to page 7 on the, which is the part for the needs scholarship, the old number was 1575 and it's not divisible by 12. So explain why then you can run that out and you can't run others out.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers, it's not a matter of can or can't. It is a matter of efficiency, ease, and consumption on the student bill. It really is, our suggestion in agreement with my colleagues at the commission, it would be a recommendation for ease of processing, not that it cannot be done, but it improves the efficiency of all of our financial aid models in the packaging process.
Just a quick follow-up.
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Chairman, so in fact, you do run out the denominator on that one. Okay, thank you. And then to my first question, I'll let you answer it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers, yes, I think right now it says 1655. Moving that to 1656 would allow it to be divisible by 12. And when in looking at it compared to what you might do if you were to do 1,800 for the one on page 5, if you did 900, which is exactly half on the page 6, then on page 7, the number would be 1,680 to be in alignment with that. But yeah, that would be another one where moving it up to the 12 would be helpful.
Mr. Chairman.
So that wasn't the answer to my first question. So my first question, Mr. Chairman, was So first dollar in
I can answer.
currently versus last dollar in. I mean, we could change this to a last dollar in scholarship. And then people would go through the gyrations of finding other financial aid, and then we bring in this dollar if they need it. So there is that possibility. And what is the advantage of one over the other from your perspective?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Sommers, I will start on that and I will let Mr. Moore finish that up. So let's talk about the first dollar because it is a first dollar funding the way that it works now. There are various scholarships or funding sources that don't allow for tuition and fees the way that this one does. So it can cover the first dollar and then it allows for those other funding sources to come in and help with the total cost of attendance, which we know is a significant challenge for students. In terms of what may potentially be coming, for example, the College Promise funds on the federal side, it is a question that I specifically asked. If there is the first dollar funding already in place and this funding is also first dollar, is that permissible then to stack that on top? And it is. So at least that's what we understand at this point. So they wouldn't compete, but they would not disallow one for the other. And that is something to know. In terms of looking to see which way would be best, I think right now, I would need to take a look at it because what I wouldn't want to do is the way that it looks at need and the amount of need that is left, we could have some really stellar students that may not then qualify to where in the first dollar, it allows them to qualify and really supports them in the hard work that they did as Chairman Scott talked about. So just off the top, I'm not sure that change is, we could have some unintended consequences that we're not aware of, and we might not be really incentivizing some of those top students who might not have unmet need based on their FAFSA.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sommers. So I'm not prepared to give you a position statement for the university related to that. But what I will say that is worth consideration, there are lots of aid sources across the country that are specific to being last dollar in, which puts a lot of competition on which one of those last dollar sources do I accept or not. One thing that I do know is true is we recognize students each year who are benefited by the incredible generosity of the state of Wyoming through the Hathaway and this committee's stewardship. Because this is a first dollar in source, it is a known quantity that those students can then look for last dollar in sources to complement their need. So not to state a position, but just to offer insight from the application of how we administer this particular scholarship. There's great benefit in it being a first dollar in.
Yeah, just one follow-up, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. So the one criticism I hear out there is kids making money while they're in school. So they get so many scholarships that they make money during a semester. That happens. And so then you ask about the stewardship of state dollars and whether we should be in the business of paying students to go to college above and beyond the cost of college. So I'm interested in that. Maybe that happens very rarely and it's just legend, but I don't think it's legend.
Mr. Chairman, I'll take a stab at that and I'm going to have Mr. Moore fix anything that I say. There is what is called the total cost of attendance. And when they do the packaging of financial aid, that is a maximum amount that they're eligible to receive. So when you talk about, sometimes there is that perception. We know the amount of Hathaway does not come close to the total cost of attendance. And when they're packaging across the sources, there is an upper limit called the total cost of attendance.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm doing math over here and I appreciate the dividable by 12. So I'm trying to sort through some solutions rather than doing this periodically. How do we structure this so that when we revisit this down the road, when we want to increase amounts, we are mindful of this? So I'm thinking, but I want your feedback on it. So looking, I guess, starting on page 4, you have this. Initially, it was $840 amount. We propose in this bill to go to $885. So on the higher end, it's $888 per semester, or on the lower end, $876. One way we could, so I mean, that's a policy choice we could make if we want to tinker with this draft. But maybe more pointedly, I did more math on the lower one, where we, right now it's 1,260. We proposed 1,325. So looking at that one, we could either go to 1,320, which is $110 per credit hour, or 1,332, which is $111 per credit hour. So a conceptual amendment would be, you word this to say $110 per credit hour, not to exceed 1,332 per semester at an eligible institution if enrolled for 12. Would that additional language be something you guys would support? And then as we go through this, committee members, I think, I think we need to make some choices if we want to worry about the divisible by 12 issue. Going on to page 5, it would be, if we went on the lower end, just $1 off. If we went on the upper end, it'd be $11 off. But that's what we do in the legislature, right? We fight over these dollars. So just some feedback on that. And if we decide to pursue that, I'd be looking for some guidance from committee members.
Okay. Would you like to weigh in?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I would need to take a look at that to see how that would work. As you noticed what I did, instead of going down, I went up in part thinking about the total cost to the students. So I need to read it and see that, but I would certainly be open to some way that we could do what you just said. And find some way to do that. The reason I was looking at the 1765 up to the 1766 and then the suggesting of the 1800 was knowing this is in endowment funds and knowing that it would probably meet that aspect of the America's College Promise so that the state of Wyoming would be eligible. So I would also have that nuance built into this.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I would say that conceptually, I think that gets to the point that we're going to. I'm a visual reflector, so I would need to see it, but I think you're totally on track with what we're trying to accomplish.
Chairman, and just as a follow-up, it'd be putting the math in the language so that you would see the per credit hour amount with the cap of the 12-hour semester. And the only thinking behind that, Mr. Chairman, is so that in 5-10 years or whenever the legislature wants to come back, they'll see they need to do the math. And that 12 will be built in there.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Co-Chair, I would like the opportunity to add one point of clarification for Representative Sommers related to his question about the divisibility of the need-based. It occurs to me that in particular related to the need-based calculation, not based on hours, it's based on an individual student's estimated family contribution. So that's why that particular one does not have the same challenge with the divisibility of the others.
Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, you've been talking some about prospective federal legislation, and I want to get a little better understanding. This is the Biden administration's effort to make community college entirely free. Is that what you're talking about? And what is that included in? Is it a standalone bill? Is it in one of these other big stimulus packages?
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chair Senator Scott, actually it's been proposed through multiple administrations. So I just want to throw that out there. It's coming forward very directly right now. It is actually in two mirror bills, standalone bills called America's College Promise. It is also in the working draft of the America's Family Plan. That is in fact the case. America's Family Plan. That one is one in the Biden administration. Right now, it is appearing in both with the intent that it come forward at least in one of them. So if it passes in the America's College Promise bill, which that one's the one has a lot of energy with it. If it passes there, it will be peeled out of the draft of the Families Plan. That is our understanding when talking to the Department of Education.
Chairman, I would make a general point on those particular pieces of legislation. We have a provision in our Wyoming State Constitution that applies, I guess, technically to the university, but I think we've created it as applying to the community college as well, where the higher education ought to be as nearly free as possible. That's not unique among the 50 states, but I think it's uncommon. And I think we're the ones that have actually implemented it. As I understand, am I misunderstanding the federal legislation that because of that, and because of the way we've behaved, this federal legislation would be the least helpful to Wyoming and the most helpful to the states that have been, shall we say, cheap in funding their higher education and not done as good a job as we have. Am I misunderstanding how the federal legislation would work?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair Senator Scott, it is one of the reasons they are meeting with all 50 of the states. I'm very pleased to say that Wyoming was their first state because of this unique endowment structure that the state has. And they want to make sure that that whatever is final in those bills does not unintentionally compromise states like ours with a small population. What I can tell you about it right now is because Wyoming's tuition is actually lower than the median, they are looking at the median amount, and our state would benefit more so than those states that are not funding their students very well because they already have this higher tuition. So it's an interesting dynamic that in many ways our state would benefit, and in many ways already has a structure that is going to help qualify for this aid. Particularly, Tennessee gets a lot of attention for the Tennessee Promise, right? But the Wyoming Hathaway predates that and does provide a structure. What we've asked them to do is to make sure that the funding does not only cover community colleges. If we can cover, for example, community colleges through this, potentially through the Wyoming's Tomorrow, then the funding could also be applicable to our university. So we are asking for the best of both worlds.
Okay, getting back to the topic at hand with the Hathaway Scholarship, are we going to have a prolonged discussion on the rest of this meeting? And we're 12:15 right now. I'm wondering if we should recess, or if you'd like to proceed with it the way it is, or what's your pleasure?
Finish public comment.
Okay, finish public comment. Yes.
And I would have amendments,
Okay,
whatever you'd want to work on.
yeah,
And Mr. Chairman,
I think there'll be several amendments before we get through here. Any other public comment? Are you two finished with yours?
Yes, thank
Public
you.
comment? Okay. Any other public comment?
Mr. Chairman, we do have one online. Matt Sackett with the Treasurer's Office.
Okay, let's bring them on then.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Mr. Chairman Paxton, Chairman Scott, members of the committee, Matt Sackett with the treasurer's office. Trying to get the capital in there too, so there we go. Just a couple comments. Keep this short. I know you got lunch coming, so the treasurer's office is very supportive of the expenditure timing flexibility that Ms. Hoag outlined in her memo, and also Representative Harshman and Mr. Wilmarth explained very well. We literally are moving from the money from the left pocket to the right pocket, to the left pocket, to the right pocket. So some kind of mechanism to provide flexibility there would be appreciated. Like Mr. Wilmarth and Representative Harshman said, there's probably a number of ways to do this. That's really kind of a policy decision. You know, we could remove the reserve account, which is the simplest. And we could base any kind of tip to the corpus based on the expenditure account. I feel that's probably not I feel that October date kind of delay in the transfer is maybe more of the preferred method, which would be fine with us as well. I feel like that late transfer and allowing for a reserve account corpus to grow, you know, a balance to grow is maybe the preferred method, where then we could invest that maybe a little more aggressively. CIO Patrick Fleming did note we generally want at least a 5-year spend to be able to invest that money, because we wouldn't want to have a downturn and lose, you know,
Mr.
the
Chairman,
ability.
I can't hear anything.
We're having trouble understanding. I think most of us can hear you, but I'm not sure we can understand very well. Is there anything we can do to help?
Maybe I can turn my mic down. How's that? Is that better?
You're still a little muffled, I think.
Let me change my mic.
Yeah, Mr. Sackett, if you could change microphones, that might help.
How's the sound now?
That might be a little better anyway.
Let me turn it up. Sorry for that.
Well, let's try it again.
Chairman, how does that sound?
I think that's better anyway.
Okay. So to reiterate, and I'll keep it short, we're supportive of the expenditure timing changes. We could delete the reserve account or do an October type transfer. Either way would be beneficial with us. The benefit of the reserve keeping the reserve account would allow us to maybe invest more aggressively with those reserve account funds, but we want at least a 5-year spend on those, because we wouldn't want to lose the amount available for spending for scholarships. So we'd be happy to work with the LSO and the committee on language, preferred language on that. We don't need to rehash that now. I would note one thing: we do not have the ability to invest the reserve account in equities currently. In 2020, you did pass legislation that allowed common school and PMTF to be invested in equities, but so we would need to add that if that's a long-term picture. But I'll stand for any questions.
Okay, questions or comments from the committee? Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
I cannot hear anything on your end.